Lord of Mysteries. Fire of Destruction Chapter 331 to 333. Luckily, this time he was not in the spirit world for long. Adrian had barely taken a step and was already directly in the hallway with the cells dimly lit by a few torches. Adrian's brow furrowed slightly, memories of his time here passing through his mind like a bittersweet treat. No matter how much he tried, the taste still stuck on his tongue. Shaking his head, the redhead let out a soft sigh. Looks like Chicho was more considerate this time. Whispering to himself as he glanced around, he inwardly thanked the phoenix. I'm not sure if my soul could have taken another ride. In the state it's in right now after reviving 2 times so soon, I'm sure going through the spirit world would have knocked me right out. The red-haired man thought as his eyes finally focused ahead to the dark and extremely long corridor that seemed to stretch to infinity. And at the end of that infinity, he could see a faint crimson glow looming on the horizon. The torches around him danced slightly brighter, their size growing for an instant before returning to normal. Before he knew it, a grim smile had already formed on the red-haired man's face. Just as he was about to accelerate towards that crimson glow and confront those wretches, a flash of his spirituality suddenly stopped him and made him turn his gaze towards a cell a little further ahead. In that cell, unlike the others that were empty and somewhat clean, this one was incredibly dirty, stained all over with blood and human parts that varied from legs to arms. That was his cell. Following his spirituality, the path to the bars of this one, his scarlet eyes were immediately drawn to something that was floating in the blood and barely protruding from it. These themselves widened slightly, a hint of surprise present in them. He extended his hand slightly to the front. Threads invisible to almost everyone but Adrian emerged from his fingertips and moved along the bars. These moved across the ceiling of the cell until they hovered above their target. Suddenly that familiar object that was almost completely engulfed in blood rose into the air, revealing it to be a slightly broken necklace, with a spear tip that was covered in blood. The cold look in Adrian's eyes softened, and a sense of relief suddenly washed over him completely. I can't believe I almost forgot about you, little one. Speaking softly as if he were talking to a child, Adrian controlled the invisible threads coming out of his hand so that the necklace flew to him. As soon as the wet metal touched his palm, it was covered in golden fire, removing the filth that had covered it and revealing its familiar rust color. With his now clean necklace in hand, he placed it familiarly around his neck. The feel of metal against his skin brought a comfort to his heart that he didn't know he needed. Adrian, you finally came back to you? Flora questioned somewhat distrustfully. The redhead from before seemed to be gone and hers seemed to have returned. Placing a hand on the necklace, Adrian gave a somewhat embarrassed laugh. I think so. Sorry if I startled you, Flora, I wasn't really expecting that. The redhead admitted honestly, rather stunned by what happened. It's fine. I'm just glad you're you again. Flora commented with enormous relief. The way he had acted just a moment ago reminded her too much of when she watched her friend get promoted to Sequence 4. The dissonance she had experienced made her fear for her own promotion. She couldn't help but compare the two, denying to herself that she could barely contain her snort of disbelief. Divinity in Sequence 6. Yeah, right. But he did act like someone who acquired divinity. As soon as that thought crossed her mind, Flora froze. After a few seconds, she pushed the thought to the back of her mind and decided not to mention it. Adrian let out a slight sigh, abandoning the cogitation he had entered. He looked seriously at his own hand. He had finally realized what he had lost as soon as he had advanced to conspirator. I lost my emotions. What makes me most human, I lost it. The fire still burning inside him reminded him of exactly how he had acted. He could even see that horrible expression, that poor imitation of a smile he had given. His brain, which had been augmented upon reaching conspirator, found the answer as soon as he cross-referenced the information he already had and compared it to his previous state. Yes, it makes sense that I was like that as soon as I advanced to Sequence 6. Right now I'm still reviving, I'm just slowing it down. Constantly hurting myself so that I regenerate and the process can't complete as it should, that makes my soul and body unable to merge and be separated. And as long as I keep this up, that will happen again, so I have to end this as quickly as possible, before I actually lose all my emotions. Letting out a hollow laugh, he shook his head. He had finally figured out how his resurrection worked as soon as that space in his memory was filled when he entered the City of Calamities after dying for the second time. Right now, my body is bathing in the drops that fall from the cracks of my soul that are barely held together using the water of that river. As I die, my soul sinks into the river of eternal darkness. Hunter's Hallow functions as a bridge between my soul and body so I don't get lost in its depths. The river of eternal darkness was the Sephira shared by the darkness, death, and warrior pathways. That is the place where every time a living being dies it leaves its mark on it. The process for me to revive is to use my mark as a save point and rip it off to return to my body. That's why reviving hurts so much. By reviving, his soul was literally being ripped out of the river Styx. Adrian felt that this was the truth. That would also explain those monsters I saw. Those are the marks of dead people who were already consumed by the darkness of that river. Also why they appeared out of nowhere when I died for the third time. When I revived I most likely created a pulse of some kind that attracted the attention of all the marks. Why I didn't see them the second time was because it's been a long time since the first death and they probably lost interest. That would also explain Hunter's Hallow's strange liquid appearance and powers. The robe is made entirely of the water from that river. The consciousness in the dreams, the anti-divination, the how anything that attacked his soul would be directly destroyed or connected in a form of contract to it, the how his destiny and the aura of the City of Calamities were hidden. All of that was explained by Hunter's Hallow being an artifact made entirely from the water of the river of eternal darkness. That's also why my memory was erased when I died and reached that void. That was a form of protection. By functioning as a bridge, the robe can't protect me from the corruption of the river, so to fix it, it erases my specific memories about the Sephira. That's why he hadn't noticed it the first time. The only thing that had been erased was information about the river, not about the other Sephiroth. A horrible shiver ran up his back and Adrian could feel himself getting cold even though, literally, his insides were burning. What kind of monster was the bastard that brought me here? If the bastard had control over the City of Calamities and the river of eternal darkness, then that could only mean Pum. A mighty fist of golden fire connected with his face, bursting his nose and knocking out a tooth. With his attention successfully separated, he focused all his attention on drawing the sphere of light in his mind. Quote. I don't know why I'm no longer impressed to see you hurt yourself. I doubt you'll tell me, but I still have to ask. What was it this time? Flora's already accustomed voice asked with some curiosity in her tone. Spitting some blood to his side that quickly ignited into a golden fire along with the tooth and the cell where he had been tortured, Adrian snorted as he snapped out of his state of cogitation. His lost nose and tooth were almost fully repaired. I almost had naughty thoughts. The corner of his lips twitched for an instant. Conspirator's ability to relate is a double-edged sword. I started relating everything before I realized what I was about to do. Luckily for the redhead, as easy as it was to relate things he shouldn't, it was just as easy not to think about it. The conspirator's brain certainly came in handy in that regard. He just opened a mental box, put what he shouldn't think about in it, and locking it, he threw it into the deepest part of his mind. You're having more slips than you used to. Flora added burningly. You have no idea how right you are. The redhead's response confused the Jacob, but she decided to leave the subject for later. Time was running out. Ready for this? Smiling sideways, Adrian clenched his fist tightly. Those bastards owe me a new dance. Without wasting any more time and with his necklace recovered, Adrian took a step forward. And accelerated. The air whipped his body, putting up resistance, but the redhead ignored it, a huge smile on his face, not only because of the great speed he was going but because of his beating heart that screamed revenge. His eternally silent footsteps never lingered more than a second on the ground before he shot forward again, picking up more and more speed. Only a Beyander would be able to see him now, and even then they would see nothing but a blur. Adrian's enhanced mind gave a quick review of the new abilities he gained from his promotion. His sight and attention were always on the crimson sun, on the horizon that was getting bigger and bigger, approaching rapidly. His speed as he advanced to sequence 6 had increased considerably, as had all his senses and strength. Spirituality had increased by 50% and his control and power of fire had increased significantly. He was now able to move through his fire, as a magician would. The range was not as great as that of a magician, but it was still much greater than the range that Vecchio Pomodoro had. But what increased the most by far was his brain. Adrian's capacity for memory, thinking, and planning had never been so powerful. That combined with all the knowledge he could now access so much better thanks to his enhanced memory made dozens and dozens of plans line up and change with a mere thought. The ability to misdirect, confuse, and deceive his enemies had now become a true power. The ability to use these would cause him to take out or cause anyone he wanted to act as he planned. He also gained incement, the ability to incite certain thoughts and actions in a person through his words. This was the next stage of provocation. These were all the abilities of a conspirator. So, this would be the mutation that Flora spoke of. Adrian's fiery scarlet eyes stayed straight ahead and all his attention was on that. But with his enhanced mind and senses, giving a glimpse at his surroundings wasn't even distracting. He could be reading Shakespeare while drinking a cup of coffee at the same time he was dodging spears and arrows that were attacking him from all sides. He wouldn't even have to move his eyes from the book to know where they were coming from and he would dodge them with ease, not a single drop of his coffee spilled. His spatial awareness had evolved. For that very reason, Adrian had no problem looking at his arm. Threads invisible to the human eye emerged from it and began to sway in the wind. An extra ability, the trap threads. With a bit of his spirituality, he could now create almost invisible threads that could easily stretch over 50 meters, their hardness depending on the spirituality he gave them. He could make them so weak that they would break at the slightest touch or so strong that they would far exceed his tripwires but remain in that range, though he could overcome that limit by imbuing huge amounts of spirituality or by being creative. The only limit to what he could do with these new threads was his creativity. This new ability came as quite a surprise to the red-haired man as the information flashed through his head. And that was because he shouldn't have it in the first place. This is not a skill that a conspirator should have. This is one of the abilities of the Witch of Pleasure of Sequence 6. Surely the eye of the black hunting spider is one of the main ingredients of that potion, perhaps through this eye they are able to see and control these threads. Shaking his head, Adrian felt quite pleased with this unexpected but extremely useful new power. A multitude of ideas of using it already wandered and chattered energetically in his mind, eager to be tested. And I already have the best guinea pigs, the now conspirator smiled hugely. His heart pounding. The distance to the red sun was shrinking rapidly. Without further delay, the sphere of light began to draw in his mind and Adrian entered a state of semi-cogitation. All the fiery emotions subsided into sleep and he felt his mind widen. He suppressed all his desires so as not to miss the opportunity for a surprise attack. He would soon be entering the area where Joseph could detect his desire to kill him and his element of surprise would go down the drain. At the farthest point from the core, a long table covered with a white sheet was spread out, ready for the feast. The food on it, at first glance, looked delicious. Ads by PubFuture. Juicy ribs covered in an amber sauce, cakes of various sizes and colors and flavors accompanied to give a contrast to the saltiness. Beautiful men and women, all wearing revealing clothes that accentuated and flattered their beautiful figures, carried trays full of food and drinks. Moving with a simple smile on their face but whose eyes were empty. By the light skin and features, it was easy to identify that the vast majority were from the South Continent. There were a few exceptions but the vast majority were from the New World. With the number of them, it would be extremely easy to cover a large banquet and there would still be plenty of waiters left over. But they were not serving a large number of people, no, they were only serving one. Men and women, just as beautiful as the waiters and waitresses, all kneeling and carrying a large podium on their backs. A podium that was as beautifully as it was horrifically carved from dark wood. Details carved in gold and silver of roots that extended to the base, with thorns all along its path that dug into the palms and backs of the men and women who carried it, staining the ground with the crimson liquid. Sitting on a throne on this podium that was carried by all these people, made of the same wood, and had on its back the tetric figure of a malevolent tree whose fruit fell to the ground was a person. A beautiful woman wearing a beautiful and highly detailed Gothic dress that was a beautiful charcoal black. With thorn details along the skirt and arms and crimson earrings that resembled the moon. Empty black eyes gazed dully at the beautiful people beneath and in front of her. Her face was only comparable to the finest of porcelain dolls and her ashen yellow hair fell over her shoulder like a river of golden ash. At her sides, in her lap, at her feet, and behind her back were naked men and women. All of them in a wet, carnal dance in servitude to her as her neck was lapped by one of the maids. Black lips rose in slight satisfaction as she let herself be carried away by the desires of her slaves. She was the mother of filth, Abrahal, one of the 3 angels of the Rose School. Away from the banquet and at a table quite apart was another group also being served by a group of waiters. They were a group of 3 people, each one more tetric and perverse than the previous one. The first seated on the left side was a woman of clear biome ascendancy. With long, flowing black hair and deep, Machiavellian yellow eyes. A smile on her delicate lips would send shivers down the spine of anyone who saw her as being a pale and clear mockery of a human smile. The second and seated in the middle was a man of elegant and sophisticated appearance, which was slightly contradicted by the wicked tattoo that ran down from his right eye until it disappeared into the collar of his shirt. With grayish skin and an above-average build, this man gave the appearance of someone you couldn't turn your back on. Last and seated on the right was another woman. She wore an elegant red dress, and her black hair that had jeweled details shone with sensuality. Eating with one hand the soft pink flesh while with the other she groped one of the waiters, she had a perverse aura covering her whole being, as if just breathing near her would poison anyone. They were 3 of the 6 saints of the Rose School. From left to right. Mistress of Depression, Lyodera. Scourge of Evil, Cranoa. And Princess of Lust, Subik. The woman on the left lifted the sweet wine to her lips, the light touch of blood causing her to click her tongue in slight annoyance. You are losing your touch, Mr. Cranoa. This last batch came out bitter. The elegant man let out a disappointed sigh and lowered his own glass. I'm sorry for your disappointment, miss. It seems the lesser links in the family are doing a sorry job. I'll have a chat with them. His black eyes looked at the crimson liquid in his glass, the corner of his lips lifting slightly mischievously, a snake ready to bite. Parting with a trickle of saliva still binding them together, Subik tossed the spiritless body aside and used a handkerchief to wipe his lips. Looks like your family is losing touch. This is the 3rd time in the last 5 months that a batch has come out bitter. That's the effect of having such a large batch to control. It's inevitable that there will be some that don't meet the quality standard. Grabbing the bottle from which the wine was poured, Cranoa looked at the bottle's tail. Besides, I'll pay a personal visit to this farm. This is their 2nd mistake in the last few years. The sooner the better, Lydiera said as she popped another piece of red meat into her mouth. Nodding slightly as she felt the good taste, at least the food is delicious. You know. Before they could continue their conversation, the mother of filth Abrahal suddenly stood up, with a calm expression. All sound died at the table and the 3 saints suddenly stood up and bowed deeply. Ignoring the group of 3, her eyes moved with purpose around them. We have company. No sooner had she said that, from the floor of the cavern rose a huge number of bone monsters. Ranging in size from normal people to giants over 15 meters, there were even a few dragon skeletons. The presence of death itself showed and everything began to decay. The food began to rot and the young waiters quickly fell to the ground as white skeletons. Even the saints were not spared from this as they fell to their knees, blood dripping from their eyes and ears and looking much older than a moment ago. A layer of ice formed all over the ground and began to spread with great speed. Abrahal looked at everything with cold eyes. She grew to a ridiculous size, easily reaching the huge ceiling of the cavern. Opening her mouth to the point where it could easily swallow a house, a horrible screech resounded, whipping the skeletons into a huge pile of harmless rabbits and sheeps. Her form then changed to that of a giant and extremely thin doll whose woven eyes looked at the 3 demigods. Immediately, the doll's arm shrank and aged to the point that it looked like an old rag. The sudden aging that the demigods went through disappeared completely, returning to their former appearances. They all had grim expressions and without needing to be told anything, they immediately tried to leave the place by their own means. Lyodera and Suchik tried to jump through the reflection of the wine bottle to escape but found themselves unable to do so. Cranoa on his side tried to sink into the shadows but also failed. Abrahal looked at the group in her giant form. Her dry arm didn't seem to bother her at all. Looking around, her eyes scanned beyond the material world. This space has been sealed. You will not be able to escape as long as the barrier remains. A voice as delicate as her appearance left her lips, her eyes still searching for the enemy that had done this. Suddenly, her eyes focused on the other side of the cavern, where suddenly a bone door had formed and a giantess walked out of it, a vacant expression on her face and wearing extremely ancient clothing. Not even a second passed before her form suddenly grew and burst into white flames. A huge white firebird completely covered the ceiling of the cavern. Its entire body was covered with hundreds of markings and seals of unknown meaning and seemed to be moving with the white flames that made up its body. Abrahel immediately responded in kind by revealing her own mythological creature form. An ancient and malevolent doll, without eyes but whose expression was one of pain, its entire body was covered with thorny vines. Its empty eyes reflected the figure of the bird of legends. Without fear, the doll faced the fire of death. The demigods in the face of the appearance of the forms of complete mythological creatures could only do their best to try to survive. Arriving much faster this time, Adrian was now standing in front of the large entrance to the crater where the pillar used to be. His senses opened and his eyes quickly scanned the surroundings, looking for any traps, guards, or alarms that may discover his presence. His scarlet eyes moved intensely but found nothing. He shrank back and approached slowly, but before he was a few meters from reaching the entrance, he took a big leap towards the wall. Threads came out of his hand and these quickly stuck and sank into the wall, functioning as hooks. He carefully propped his feet on the wall and looking at where the threads were, he gave a satisfied inward nod. Hiding in the darkness and barely peeking out, he finally had the core in sight. As that, Flora found herself unable to finish the question, not for lack of words but because of the disturbing scene. So that's the core. Quite fitting. Adrian thought calmly. The semi-cogitative state seemed to keep those primal instincts from kicking in and screaming. Despite the distance, he could see quite well. Where the pillar once stood there was now a huge trunk, the lake of blood, and the island of flesh were gone, leaving behind huge roots that stretched an unknown distance into the earth. Moving as if they were crawling and trying to take their first steps. These roots had veins that pulsed with the blood that passed from them. All of these roots moved to the center of the trunk, where before was the top of where the bodies reached. There was now something that could only be described as an aberration. He could see where the roots that appeared to be those of a tree ended, and when they touched the core they took on a fleshy appearance on both sides. Huge dormant lumps that a grown man could easily fit into with room to spare. The center was swollen with an unknown liquid and with something moving within it. Moving with life but not with enough strength or consciousness to come out. A thick layer of flesh prevented seeing what was inside, but from the look of it, you didn't have to be a genius to know what it was. His spirituality screamed at him that turning on his spiritual vision would be a terrible idea, and the mere act of looking at it made his head start to hurt. Ravings threatened to ring and break his semi-cognitive state, so he quickly looked away. Those should be the fallopian tubes and those lumps the ovaries. The nucleus is a giant uterus. Yuck. The red-haired man thought with revulsion, not in the least trying to hide his disgusted face. If he wasn't in cogitation, he was sure his instincts would be screaming so loudly that they would make him lose control. At least Chicho's information was correct. There are only those 5 ridiculous ones. His eyes narrowed on the figures surrounding the crater where the womb was located. These figures were either sitting or standing, all facing the life-giver with somewhat varied expressions. The doctor, who was still wearing an elegant white suit, was looking at it with a small smile. Behind him was Joseph, standing like a personal guard. At the other end was Wraith Steve, who stood alone and looked at everything with an arrogant expression. Werewolf Jason and Zombie Tyre were together, both close enough to Steve but still far enough away not to be glued together. They were all being illuminated by the soft yet strong crimson glow coming from the inflated womb. A glow that made the red-headed man sick to his stomach at the mere sight of it. Why are you still in your human form? Did they ban animals in the birthing zone or what? Adrian narrowed his eyes as he looked at the werewolf. According to his messenger, this light simulated the blood moon. He should be transformed, already close to losing control. Same with Steve and Tyre, they should be in a similar state, but they all look great. Sure. This for sure is thanks to the very dear and helpful doctor. Rolling his eyes, his sight moved slightly to the man but only focused on the rocks farthest away from him, so as not to have his attention focused on him and avoid alerting the devil guard. From the regeneration he has shown and that healing ability, plus those ivies with thorns. He may be part of the moon pathway. Sequence 5 of that path is called Scarlet Scholar. That sequence has abilities related to the moon. It's not unreasonable to think that he's making sure they're not losing their minds and dancing around like drunk monkeys. Adrian felt he was right. But the more he thought about it, the more his brow furrowed. Hiding again in the darkness of the doorway, he brought a hand to his chin and calmly taped it. His abilities are weird. They are nothing like the Scarlet Scholar I know about from the original story. There are too many differences to the point that it should be a whole new pathway. But is that possible? Maybe. If I am dealing with a new pathway, then I have to put together what I know. This pathway focuses on regeneration and some control over plants. He doesn't have the aura or presence that a demigod would have, so he can't be higher than sequence 5. That regeneration seems to have several conditions. The most important one would be touching the person he wants to heal. Of course, I also can't rule out that it can also change the structure of the body by touching it. That's within the limits that a sequence 5 Beyander can do without entering the demigod realm. Clicking his tongue, he immediately noted the danger that could be noted. It was quite possible that he was dealing with a discount mojito. Since he's not dead, I'm sure he doesn't touch the soul when healing, so it's merely physical. But from how much he seems to know about me, I shouldn't rule out that he knows that touching my soul is a big no-no. He wasn't sure if it was direct skin contact or touching was enough, but from what he had seen, it was very likely that it would have to be skin contact. I also can't rule out that he can create other kinds of plants besides those spirit-sucking ivies. Maybe he can generate flowers that spit poison or a paralytic agent. There's also the fact that he has to possess certain powers over the moon field, otherwise it wouldn't make sense how the three musketeers keep walking around so calmly. Letting out a light, soundless sigh, the red-haired man gently clenched his fist. My only job is to damage the uterus. Once that happens, Chicho will get me out of here and I won't have to deal with this. But what if the damage I do isn't enough? I'll have to deal with those 5, and once they figure out what I want to do, they won't let me do it as easily as before. I have to do this right. I can't leave anything to chance, and I have to make sure I get this over with in one shot. Nodding inwardly, the corners of the redhead's lips lifted. The Jacob grasped this, and internally she smiled as well. Action plan. Oh ho ho, you're going to love this. Adrian motioned to speak, but no sound came out, but for a parasite that was no problem. I'm all ears, Flora returned mischievously. Vengeance dripped from her words. ... Adjusting his very blood-like crimson tie, Doctor looked behind him with his lips raised slightly. This is for celebration, dear. We are witnessing the beginning of the fall of the kingdom of Loan. Not since the death of Emperor Russell has the fall of an empire been seen like today. Joseph nodded slightly at his lord's words. It is without doubt quite an occasion. Saying or adding nothing more, he returned his attention to looking around him like a demon knight. His lips dropped again and his brow furrowed slightly. The doctor then began to tap his bicep in concentration. Still thinking about Adrian Kenway, my lord? Sigh. Shaking his head softly, the doctor just let out a small chuckle. It's just how easy this whole thing was. Capturing a herald. That was a stroke of luck. Finding this, a miracle, is an understatement. His gaze then settled on starless skies. His lips and cheeks cracked and a smirk appeared. Total elation dripped along with his saliva. Ads by PubFuture. This was undoubtedly a divine intervention. Primordial moon's descent is near. I can feel it. The fall of the false gods is near. Letting out a small smile, Joseph placed a hand on his chest and made a small bow. This is a total success for the Rose School since it was expelled from the South Continent. We will finally repay the damage the churches did to us over 100 years ago. The man's eyes widened in shock as his sense of danger began to scream. What? Suddenly, the crimson glow was blinded by a huge golden glow from above. Quickly looking up, Joseph and the doctor watched in astonishment as a giant golden fireball fell with enormous speed towards them. It was as big as a house. They barely had time to wrap themselves in shadows before the golden meteor descended fully and exploded with a mighty boom. The farthest trio watched the ball in amazement and surprise. Werewolf Jason couldn't stop his jaw from hanging. Fush, fush, fush. The sound of wind moving at great speed caused Wraith Steve to turn just in time to see a shower of golden fire ravens descend upon them. Take cover. Shouting the order as a wall of transparent ice rose up to cover him, Steve could only grit his teeth at the brutal assault. Zombie Tyre, being so close to Werewolf Jason, made the same move as before and took cover along with his partner in a dome of ice. Boom. An enemy snuck in. That's impossible. How did they get past all the security? The doctor thought incredulously as he stepped out of the shadows a little away from the golden fire that completely covered the area where they were, his gaze to the sky in search of the enemy as behind him came a serious Joseph. They both managed to escape the explosion by using the shadows. Suddenly, the forest of golden fire next to them spread out and a large number of golden ravens rushed towards them, screeching loudly and flapping their wings with power. Clicking his tongue in annoyance, the doctor extended his hand, and from the ground in front of him came black thorny ivies that moved like snakes and lunged at the ravens. His eyes focused not on the ravens but all around him, obviously seeing that the ravens in the attack earlier were nothing more than a distraction. That was a mistake. The most forward raven and the one that would be the first to be countered by the doctor's black ivies suddenly lost its form and jumping through the fire teleportation, a scarlet blur came out of it. Fush! Fush! With such ridiculous speed that Joseph and the doctor were unable to react and leaping over the ivy snakes. A powerful hand covered in fire grabbed the doctor's head and the man stared at its owner in astonishment. Did you miss me, bastard? With a crazed grin on his face, Adrian Kenway shouted in amusement as a huge explosion concentrated on the doctor's head. Boom. Plop. Bones and gray matter flew everywhere and Joseph could barely react to block a flame-covered kick to his face by crossing his arms. To add to his disbelief, the force of the kick knocked him off his feet and sent him flying. But his flight was cut short when he couldn't even get more than 3 meters away from the red-haired man before he stopped in midair and was drawn towards a crazily grinning Adrian who welcomed him by trying to bury a flaming sword in his head. Joseph could barely twist his body to dodge the lunge, but for doing so this time he failed to dodge the kick that connected with enormous power on the left side of his face, which in turn was covered in golden flames. Again he was sent flying but could not get more than about 2 meters away before returning to his smiling attacker. What's wrong, bitch? Why don't you defend yourself? Grinning, Adrian threw a punch from which came a huge and concentrated torrent of golden flames that connected squarely in the devil's chest, who could only howl in pain as he felt the holy power burning his flesh. This time he was sent flying. To his ears came the distinctive sound of a wire breaking. Pum, pum, pum. His body bounced several times on the hard stone, pieces of it digging into his skin and tearing it. His world was spinning and his danger sense was screaming. Gritting his teeth and enduring the pain caused by the flames, his body swelled and his skin darkened. His stature grew and horns and bat's wings grew from his back. The stone heated up until it melted and a greatsword of red magma quickly formed in his hands, and Joseph barely had time to raise his greatsword above his head to block the slash of a golden sword. Boom! What is this strength? The demon thought in disbelief as he felt his knees buckle under the enormous pressure that made his entire body tremble from merely blocking the attack. Before he could counterattack, the opposing force against him suddenly disappeared and he continued his slash to nothing, his guard completely exposed. Adrian had discarded his sword and let inertia play a bad hand on the horned demon. Ducking under the slash and with his eyes glittering with bloodlust, Joseph watched in terror as in the red-haired man's other hand a new blade had formed. His sense of danger activated again and Joseph raised his free arm and barely managed to block the thrust that aimed to pierce his head. The sword reached the bone and almost pierced it. A howl of pain came from his mouth and he tried to use full language to gain distance, but his mouth and face were blocked by a powerful hook wrapped in golden fire. Pum. Crack. The satisfying sound of a nose cracking against his knuckles caused the feral grin on Adrian's face to spread even wider. His threads were once again unable to stop the flight of the fully transformed Joseph, but this only made him laugh even harder as he watched his body bounce along the ground. Ha 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 ha. Even then you can't defend yourself. Are you that useless? The red-haired man laughed provocatively as he gave a mighty stomp, and with Sky Wach he once again gave chase to the devil. The feeling of his threads snapping made him take a step to the side, dodging the meteorite, which was a rather burnt zombie tire glaring at him furiously. You bastard. Oops, I didn't notice you went to the spa. That tan looks divine on you. Laughing amused at the burnt appearance of the undead, Adrian took another step to the side, dodging an extremely burnt and just as furious and fully transformed werewolf Jason, who had white foam coming out of his snout. Blocking both sides of the man, both members of the Rose School rushed towards the red-headed man, who watched this with a mocking sideways grin. Aw, does the little puppy want to play too? Don't worry, I brought extra toys. Laughing, Adrian stomped the ground and a powerful wave of fire surrounded him, a wave that didn't take long to spread around him and hit the zombie and werewolf squarely. Zombie tire covered his body with a layer of ice, while werewolf Jason could only cover his face and howl in pain as he felt the holy flames burn his skin. Again leaping through the flames and reappearing in front of the werewolf, With a huge predatory grin, Adrian formed a holy fire sword from the remains of the wave from before and prepared to cut the little dog in two. A vibration on the ground caused him to abandon his attack and take a huge leap into the air, barely dodging the raging ivies that tried to catch him. So what they say is true. Cockroaches don't need their heads to survive. Adrian shouted mockingly, as well as annoyed, as he watched the doctor's headless body stand again. His fine white suit was completely ruined with burns, blood, and dirt. His spirituality flared and Adrian disappeared again in a tongue of golden flames, appearing on the ground and quite a bit further away from where Tyre and Jason were standing from one of more leftover flames from his previous wave of fire. Better luck next time. Smiling, Adrian watched as a somewhat burned Steve, his red coke heavily damaged, suddenly appeared where he stood. An extremely annoyed expression on his face, but even that couldn't hide the disbelief of seeing it. How is it possible? The man mumbled, but to Adrian's sensitive ears, it was as if he was speaking normally. This only made his smile that never left his face grow again. From the rubble behind them rose an angry Joseph, his face badly bruised and burned, his nose bent and several of his teeth missing, the arm he had used to block the lunge hung limp. Green blood covered his face and chest, acting as a retardant that was slowly healing him, but the damage from the holy flames made regeneration very slow. Walking with far more ease than he should have, the doctor's headless body stood in front of the quartet. He took it out something of his pocket, something that Adrian was unable to see because his fist was clenched, and placed it in the missing space in his neck. Suddenly and with great speed, a miniature head began to grow. After a few seconds, the doctor had his head back. A cold and empty look on his face, whose full attention was on the red-haired man who was more than 30 meters away from them. Quote. How? Let me tell you, Doc. This does look more like a party. With magic tricks and all. Keeping his smile and completely ignoring the question, he stomped his foot, and all around him ignited in golden flames, creating a large circle around him. The ivies he could feel moving under the ground shrieked and died from the holy fire, and he watched as Wraith Steve reappeared with an annoyed expression on his face as he was once again blocked by the flames of the sun. Smiling, Adrian wagged his finger from side to side, causing a vein to throb in the Wraith's neck. The doctor's brow furrowed for a moment before he let out a chuckle that quickly grew into a laugh. You came back from the dead just to confront us here. You're not right in the head, Mr. Kenway. What do you want me to say? You should have ripped my heart out to make sure I wouldn't come back for yours, Adrian said mockingly as he chuckled under his breath. Between the lines, the power of deception and manipulation crept hidden with venom. Shaking his head, the smile on the doctor's face was one of mockery and contempt. I don't know how you did it, but I think I'll do that. Letting out another laugh, the doctor looked at him with his tetric grin from ear to ear. This time I'll rip out your heart and break your spine to prevent this from happening again. Maybe I'll take your legs and arms too. He moved and touched Jason and Joseph's shoulders, their wounds disappeared in seconds and they too smiled again. Adrian clicked his tongue at that, and the circle of golden flames grew a little bigger again, burning the ivies that tried but failed to get close to him. Smiling at the red-haired man, the devil Joseph sneered. You shouldn't have come back here. We outnumber you. You're trapped with us. I don't know where you got an artifact from the barred pathway, no doubt you're not alone, but it doesn't matter. Our forces will deal with your companions and it's only a matter of time before that artifact breaks. What do you think you will be able to do when that happens? Not only did you come here to die again, Mr. Kenway, but you also dragged your partner with you. I almost feel sorry. The doctor couldn't believe there was anyone crazy enough to believe he had a chance in this situation. Adrian may be a herald, but what does he think he can do being outnumbered 1-5? Say man looked stunned by the doctor's words before his body began to shake slightly. Quote. He, ha, ha, ha ha, ha ha, ha 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 ha, ha 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 ha. Clutching his sides from the laughter he was unable to contain, tears fell from his eyes. The smile on the doctor's face diminished more and more until it disappeared and was replaced by a slight frown. The same with his group, who looked at their scowls at the man in front of them. You ha ha ha. Do you guys seriously believe that? Ha 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 ha. Between laughter and tears over these, Adrian pointed his finger at them with an incredulous look. A vein began to throb in the brows of werewolf Jason and zombie Tyre, who inadvertently took a step forward only to be stopped by a serious Steve, who also looked with great annoyance at the red-haired man who was still laughing. With a vein throbbing in his neck, the doctor did not hide his annoyance. What's so funny? What don't we understand, Mr. Kenway? Did you lose your mind after reviving? Holding a hand to his face, Adrian took a moment to collect himself. Looking at them with one eye glinting between his fingers, a tetric smile on his face. Huff huff. You are really funny. Don't you get it? Squinting, Doctor bowed slightly, his spirituality suddenly telling him a warning. The same for Joseph, who manifested another magma greatsword, sweat suddenly covering his face. Something's wrong. Joseph suddenly thought uncomfortably. His hands clenched tightly. A feeling shared by the doctor, whose smile had already disappeared. Golden flames enveloped the red-haired man's legs as extremely delicate invisible threads began to emanate from his entire body, extending up to 5 meters. Stronger threads wrapped around his legs like a protective mesh. A huge predatory smile on his face, and his scarlet eyes were glowing brighter than before. His torso and arms were wrapped in more holy flames along with more threads. Huff, huff, I'm not trapped in here with you. With a voice that barely contained a huge thrill and with a smile that seemed to want to split his face, Adrian felt his heart pounding with excitement along with his insides burning with power. The humming of Talk Millennium strengthened his body even more, giving him more strength and speed. The chanting motivated him even more. His head was then enveloped in golden holy flames, an armor of holy fire covered the red-haired man, who now looked like a medieval knight who came out of hell itself to drag his enemies to eternal torment. The knight clenched his right fist tightly, the golden flames quickly turned white with golden flashes from the great concentration of spirituality. He charged it backwards and prepared to throw the punch. So predictable, smiling to himself as he raised his arm, the doctor prepared to raise a wall and devour the man's attack. Pum, crack, crumble. His hand froze mid-raise and his pupils shrank as, instead of launching the attack towards them, the fire knight plunged his entire arm into the ground. Shit! The doctor shouted as he leapt several meters into the air, being quickly followed by the others. Barely a second later, the ground beneath their feet shook and cracked, a tidal wave of golden tongues of flame swept across the ground and exploded, covering everything, several of these tongues so high that they scorched them again. The fire of the sun burned the shadows that died under them, the movement through the shadows in that area died with them. Suddenly, Joseph flew in front of the doctor with his magma sword held high, barely blocking Adrian's sword, which had come out of one of the tongues of fire. But the moment the two swords made contact, a concentrated explosion shattered the demon's guard, who had an incredulous expression on his dark face as a deep golden burning gash began to bleed green from his torso. With a crazed grin on his face, Adrian laughed euphorically as the flames engulfing him burned more fiercely and the threads coming out of his body fluttered madly. Scarlet eyes appeared in the middle of the fiery helmet, and a distorted and extremely powerful voice roared from this hellish night. You are trapped in here with me. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. The knight clenched his right fist tightly, the golden flames quickly turned white with golden flashes from the great concentration of spirituality. He charged it backwards and prepared to throw the punch. So predictable, smiling to himself as he raised his arm, the doctor prepared to raise a wall and devour the man's attack. Pum, crack, crumble. His hand froze mid-raise and his pupils shrank as, instead of launching the attack towards them, the fire knight plunged his entire arm into the ground. Shit! The doctor shouted as he leapt several meters into the air, being quickly followed by the others. Barely a second later, the ground beneath their feet shook and cracked, a tidal wave of golden tongues of flame swept across the ground and exploded, covering everything, several of these tongues so high that they scorched them again. The fire of the sun burned the shadows that died under them, the movement through the shadows in that area died with them. Suddenly, Joseph flew in front of the doctor with his magma sword held high, barely blocking Adrian's sword, which had come out of one of the tongues of fire. But the moment the two swords made contact, a concentrated explosion shattered the demon's guard, who had an incredulous expression on his dark face as a deep golden burning gash began to bleed green from his torso. With a crazed grin on his face, Adrian laughed euphorically as the flames engulfing him burned more fiercely and the threads coming out of his body fluttered madly. Scarlet eyes appeared in the middle of the fiery helmet, and a distorted and extremely powerful voice roared from this hellish night. You are trapped in here with me. Cough, cough. Green blood fell from Joseph's lips as his expression frowned in deep pain, the cut had gone deep, but what hurt him the most were the flames that burned just as much if not deeper. Doctor, who had half of his body burned, extended his hand to the front and tried to attack the man, but before he could do anything the flames that were still burning on his skin flashed and exploded, stopping him in his tracks. The same occurred with Joseph. Ignoring the doctor and continuing his attack, Adrian prepared to cut off the head of the demon in front of him. Seeing that the red-haired man's attack was going to continue, the next to react was Wraith Steve, who opened his mouth wide. At the same time that he prepared to launch the Wraith shriek, Adrian raised his free palm towards him. Surrounded by an almost recovered trio from the attack earlier but still keeping his mind as cold as an iceberg. In the same deep, gravelly voice, Ancient Hermes roared. Steel. Steve, who was about to shout, spat out a gargle and a somewhat confused look was born on his face. The attack he was about to launch completely forgotten, and the man hovered, not knowing what he was going to do. Princess at 9. Fush. Immediately following his partner's warning, Adrian used Sky Wach and with one step managed to dodge a furious and bleeding Joseph, who had already recovered from the attack from before but had not regenerated, clear by the open wound on his chest. Smiling at the demon, who, even though he couldn't see his smile because of the armor, felt his blood boil, the leader of the fallen gang was about to continue his attack when his expression of fury was replaced by one of alarm. The demon's sense of danger flared up again at the same time as the red-haired man's armor glowed for a second. Tell me, little Joseph, do you like fireworks? In a gentle voice, Adrian asked playfully. The helmet's scarlet eyes seemed to grin wickedly at everyone present, who looked at the flaming man in astonishment. He seriously planned to do this, son of a. Joseph immediately tried to pull away, having figured out what the flame-covered man wanted to do. But to his shock and disbelief, something that would have only taken a quick flap of his wings he found himself unable to do. It was as if his wings had suddenly found themselves covered in cobwebs. It's the same as before. The devil thought, remembering how he had been unable to get away from the red-headed man in his assault earlier. Knowing what was coming, he tried to flee through the shadows, but they still hadn't recovered, and the flames that covered the redhead killed those around him. Bastard! Roaring, Joseph tried to raise his arms in front, but the movement was too slow, confusing him even more. Looking at his arms out of the corner of his eye, he noticed how they were covered in strange and extremely thin threads. The rest of those still in the air looked alarmed at what Adrian wanted to do and tried to move away, but they were stopped by the same invisible threads. Smiling hugely at the quintet around him, Adrian said only one thing in the sweetest and gentlest voice he could give. Boom. His golden armor glowed, and in a white flash that made one think they were looking directly at the sun in the morning, it exploded, completely covering Joseph, Steve, Tyre, Jason, and the doctor. The 5 men were sent flying in different directions. Jason and Tyre, who had been the farthest away, received the least damage, while Steve and Doctor, who were at a distance, were sent flying. Joseph, who had been the closest, was the worst hit. Crack. The ground broke at his feet from the impact of his fall, his figure kneeling and covered in green blood. You crazy fucking crazy son of a bitch. The fallen gang leader roared as he watched the ball of smoke in the air with pure hatred. The bastard had blown himself up. One of his wings was gone and the other was full of holes and burning with golden flames. Half of his face and torso were full of burns and pink skin underneath. His arms were completely black, and the only reason he could still use them was because of the enormous resistance his transformation gave him and the healing properties of his green blood. Your mother would be very disappointed in you. Falling for such an obvious trick. What a disgrace. A mocking voice spoke from the smoke ball as something shot out of it at high speed. Thanks to his enhanced eyes and senses, Joseph could see that it was a large white arrow. Gritting his teeth, he tried to get up to dodge it when suddenly something rang out. Snap. Boom. Immediately followed by the snap, the fire in his wings glowed and exploded on his back, forcing him to the ground again. He was barely able to twist his torso to avoid the arrow piercing his head, causing it to sink into the ground inches from his face. Without even time to be relieved for successfully dodging, the demon immediately tried to move away from the arrow that glowed for a second. Screaming in frustration, Joseph could only cross his arms again and place his damaged wing in front of him. Boom. He barely made it a few steps before it exploded, burning and destroying his last remaining wing. His large yet damaged body was sent flying, and the devil felt his consciousness slipping away. Fush. 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 My body's resistance to explosions increased, but I'm not immune to them yet. Adrian thought calmly as the bones in his arms and the occasional ribs snapped back into place with a resounding crack. While he was almost completely immune to the flames from the explosion, he was not immune to the kinetic force generated by it. This caused slight annoyance to the red-haired man. Not from the sensation of his bones breaking and rearranging, they simply tickled him at this point, but from the fact that he wouldn't be able to do this move again until his body became immune to it. With how much fun it is to blow me to bits. What a piece of crap. Fush, fush, fush. Skywalk brought him with extreme speed closer to the devil's still flying body, not wanting to end his brutal assault on the man. Two spears formed in his hands that quickly burned white. Extending his arms as far back as he could and adding even more speed to his steps with Skywalk, Adrian spun himself around as he released the spears, which flew into the air with a hissing sound like high-speed missiles. Joseph heard his danger sense for the umpteenth time in the last few seconds, which was now becoming extremely annoying. Gritting his teeth, he tried to move, but his damaged body that was still covered by some of those strange threads was too slow. The warning cries turned into howls that he found himself unable to respond to. A sense of impending death clouded his judgment, and the man found himself falling into despair. Was this the end of him? Had he come this far? His troubled mind filled with these thoughts even as it was drowned out by the pleas of his danger sense. The shadows a little further in front of Joseph moved and trembled. From these emerged a now healed doctor who quickly caught the demon with one arm, stopping his aerial travel, and with the hand he still had free he pointed to the front. In front of him and coming out of the ground breaking it, the thorny black ivies obeyed their master and quickly began to weave between them, forming a thick and high black wall. The white spears impacted with these and with a white glow exploded, almost destroying the wall. Emerging from the shadows several dozen meters away from it, the doctor reappeared with Joseph in his arms and with his hand already on his chest healing him. "My lord," the man muttered weakly, gaining more strength at the end, and the Blood Moon leader only allowed himself a second to look at him before returning his attention to the Fire Knight who had another spear pointed at them. "Dear Joseph, don't let your guard down again. This time we cannot underestimate Mr. Kenway." Pursing his lips at his lord's emotionless voice, Joseph gave a weak nod as he stood up. "The healing almost complete. You're not looking so good, Doc. You're kind of pale." And not only that, the man looked thinner than before and his skin seemed to have dried slightly. The change in that aspect was not very noticeable, but thanks to his enhanced senses he could easily notice it. Not only did the doctor look worse, but he had gained a foul odor, like that of a body in the early stages of decomposition. "I was right. One of the conditions is to touch the one you want to heal, and not only that, it seems that doing so takes a toll on your body." Smiling, having confirmed his theory, Adrian charged his arm. The spear left his hand and quickly traveled through the air towards the duo, but before it could get any closer to them it was intercepted by spears of transparent ice. The man did not have time to see where the spears came from, as he had to stomp backward to dodge even more of these ice spears that destroyed the place where he was, and from that place, a light layer of ice began to spread on the ground. A layer that did not reach far, because as it approached Adrian it melted into vapor. He again felt some of the multiple threads coming from his body break, and he quickly turned around and raised his elbow, blocking a fist of ice from a furious tire, a proper armor of ice covering his body. Pum. Fuss hhhhhhhh. A shockwave of wind shot out from the impact, causing the flames covering Adrian to dance gracefully. The red-haired man felt his arm tremble slightly from the force of the blow, and also as the zombie's fist ice and curses tried to spread to him, but the holy fire eliminated them before they had a chance to do anything. Not having expected his punch to be blocked so easily, Tyre looked somewhat stunned at the man in front of him. "Hey, nice trick." Praising without praising the zombie's new card, Adrian laughed softly. The unhinged grin on his face grew even bigger as he threw a right hook of his own. But Zombie Tyre raised his ice-covered elbow to block, and Adrian's fist of golden fire made contact with the undead man's arm. Boom! A concentrated explosion on impact caused the arm Tyre used to block to go out to the side in flames, the ice armor failing to withstand the assault of the sun's fire. The undead's eyes widened as pain covered his expression. The fire covering Adrian's body burned even brighter, slightly melting the ice covering the zombie, who in response could only try to create more to replace what was broken. "Mine is better," Adrian roared as he threw another punch. Boom, boom, boom. Without stopping, Adrian launched a hail of golden fists at Tyre. Each impact was accompanied by a concentrated explosion that destroyed the ice armor. Boom, 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 boom. Right hook, left, to the kidney, low kick, medium kick, high kick. Uppercut. A full assault fell upon the zombie who could do nothing but defend himself. In just a few seconds, Tyre went from a decent offense to a pitiful defense. The zombie could do little and nothing to defend himself. Not only did the man's explosive fists destroy his armor as soon as he summoned it, but every attempt to cover himself was crushed with even more ferocity. Blood quickly covered his body and despair began to overwhelm him. His movements were becoming clumsy, increasingly slow and predictable. Not only because of his desperation that was affecting his judgment but because of the invisible threads that were slowly slowing him down. Tap tap tap. Taking a step to the side and without taking his eyes off the zombie who seemed to be having difficulty moving already, Adrian threw a backhanded punch that landed squarely on Jason's face, who tried to attack from behind. Boom. The werewolf was sent flying and his flight was only stopped by the ice spears from before that dug into his back and caused him to let out a howl of pain. Go back to your cage, little doggy. Adrian said in an icy voice without looking back. With the short time given by his companion, Tyre desperately tried to pull away from the Fire Knight, but as soon as he took a step back his body froze, immobilized. Looking alarmed at his body, he saw how it was wrapped in almost invisible threads. He felt that they were not very strong. If he put a little strength into it, he could run away. Boom. An explosive fist smashed into his face, sending him to the ground with several teeth missing and his nose bent horribly, his vision filled with white for an instant, the enormous hardness of a zombie's body yielding completely to the knight's assault. Didn't they tell you it's a bad idea to get distracted in the middle of combat? Adrian grinned madly under his helmet as he held Tyre's head and prepared to blow it to pieces. Ads by PubFuture. Before he could do so, some of the threads on his back snapped and a sword quickly formed in his free hand. Clash. Fush. Turning around, he gave a quick slash, cutting dry the slash of a healed Joseph who looked at him furiously. His eyes were red and huge veins pulsed in his neck. Princess from behind. Flora roared and immediately Adrian felt his threads cut behind him. He saw, as out of the shadows a few feet from where he blocked Joseph came the doctor. A vacant expression on his face as at his feet the spiky black ivies sprang out and rushed towards him, while at the same time his hands now held something. Being just as large as he was and emitting a foul as well as perverted aura. With a crimson glow similar to blood and dripping a black liquid from its edge. The doctor carried in his hands a huge monstrous scythe. Not alarmed, Adrian simply tried to take another flaming jump to dodge the attack, but his eyes widened slightly under his helmet. He felt his connection to the jump suddenly severed. Behind Joseph's back and moving at his side, a furious Jason extended his claws towards his face. Claws dripping with purple venom. He also felt Tyre rise from the ground behind him and rush towards him. Despite the brutal assault the undead suffered, he lived up to the zombie's great vitality and got up to continue fighting. Being surrounded on all sides and without the opportunity to escape or dodge comfortably as Joseph was holding him in place and the duo of Tyre and Jason blocked his exits, and with the doctor a few steps away from him. Adrian found himself in a precocious situation. But despite that, the man's mind was calm. Having a great deal of experience with dealing with more than one enemy, Adrian found himself serene. It must be because of that strange scythe. One of its abilities may be cutting a Beyander ability. Considering the ability to absorb the strength of the ivy, it's not too crazy to think that weapon is capable of that. But it doesn't seem to be able to cut many powers, but at least it can choose which one to cut and choose when to do it. It's like a farmer, picking the harvest when it's already ripe. Immediately relating his inability to jump and the strange weapon in the man's hands in less than 3 seconds thanks to the enhanced brain of a conspirator, the red-haired man only grinned in amusement. What a curious and useful ability. Curious. At this point, Joseph should have appeared by now to have helped in the assault, but he still hasn't done so. Did he abandon his companions and lord and run away like the cowardly rat he is? Nah, I don't think so. He must now think he still has the advantage, so he won't run away yet. He must be somewhere waiting for the perfect opportunity to attack. His eyes that were still focused on Joseph looked behind the devil, at the still present several spears of transparent ice. Recognition glinted in his eyes and Adrian felt his smile grow. So that's what they wanted to do, not bad. Finding the hidden conspiracy, Adrian swallowed his laughter and prepared to flip the deck. He only needed a little deceive and manipulation for this, and the cards had already been laid out a while ago. If he wasn't mistaken, it was 20 seconds to the 3-minute mark. Opening his mouth, a horrible shriek that scourged the spiritual bodies of everyone present came forth, stunning them all and even causing Jason to drop to one knee. Wraith Sheik, the ability he had stolen from Steve. Joseph's eyes blurred and blood fell from his nose. Even though he was a transformed devil, due to the proximity to the shriek, he took a considerable hit. The only thing that kept him from losing consciousness was his strength. Werewolf Jason, on the other hand, almost fainted. His already weak will made him extremely vulnerable to the spiritual attack. Zombie Tyre was the same, but he was able to withstand it better thanks to being a zombie. The ivies and the doctor froze in place for a few seconds, the black ivies screeching horribly. Being his own attack, Adrian found himself well, and taking advantage of the window he had just created, he abandoned his sword and stepped to the side, letting the magma greatsword hit the ground without doing anything to him. His fist charged with power and connected with great force. The explosive punch in the mouth of the demon's stomach, who spitting blood, was sent flying again with his abdomen in flames. Adrian immediately followed up with an explosive spinning kick to the still dazed Jason in the middle of his face that sent the little dog flying. The next second, a flaming sword formed in both hands and he raised one high and one low. Clank, clank, ice and blood clanked against holy fire and the sound of boiling water came from it. Wow, Doc. Did you come from mowing the garden or what? Adrian asked with a grin as his arms trembled slightly from the force he had to exert to keep both men at bay. I'll kill you, Tyre muttered with pure venom, his left eye completely closed and the other a blood red. With dark blue veins pulsing in his neck, the doctor gritted yellowish teeth and exerted more force on his side, which began to release crimson sparks. Seeing this, Adrian didn't waste a second and concentrated an explosion at his feet. Boom. Crumble. The ground beneath the men's feet gave way and Adrian managed to take several steps backward, gaining some distance from the duo who lost their balance at the sudden movement. Not wanting to miss his chance, the doctor let out a scream as he launched a powerful slash with his scythe. The red sparks that completely covered the blade suddenly concentrated on the edge. With a perverted glow, a sickle of crimson energy shot out of the scythe, moving with great speed at the redhead. Opening his eyes in shock, Adrian could barely raise his fire blades to block the energy sickle. Clash. This golden light collided with crimson light. Sparks flew out and the red-haired man found himself dragged several meters back, his feet sinking into the stone. His muscles swelled and he gritted his teeth against the energy of the attack. The crimson light emitting from the sickle suddenly intensified and scarlet eyes glowed in recognition. Oh shit. Boom. The sickle exploded, sending the fire knight flying. The golden armor shattered into several pieces, finally revealing half of the red-haired man's face along with part of his torso and legs. The thread meshes broke but served the function of largely protecting Adrian, who collided with the transparent ice spears from before. The surviving golden flames slowly began to fade, bringing a huge smile to the doctor's face. The 3 minutes are up. That pesky artifact must have broken by now. He shouted, hugely pleased as he relaxed slightly. Pieces of these spears flew through the air upon impact, these quickly turning to vapor at the remnants of the holy fire that still covered the red-haired man's body. The reflection of one of these transparent shards trembled slightly and the reflection of a man with greasy hair and wearing a burnt dark red cloak appeared in it. Wraith Steve. The reflection disappeared from the shard and reappeared in Adrian's scarlet eyes. A great expression of pain in the wraith as parts of his body were covered in golden fire. Wraith possession. Adrian's hand slowly went up to his neck, Steve finding moving the red-haired man's body very difficult because of the golden flames that made the possession very hard to control 100%. Jason now. The doctor roared at the werewolf who was closest to the possessed redhead. They barely had a few seconds before Steve couldn't hold on any longer. Every second that would pass would only make things worse for the wraith, who was now being purified by the dying flames. On it. The hairy man shouted euphorically as he lunged towards Adrian. His tongue hung from his broken snout and his few remaining teeth glowed in the crimson light of the log. I will tear him apart. I'll rip out his heart and eat his intestines. I will devour it. I'll devour it. I'll devour it. Jason's desire-racked mind roared hungrily as he launched himself at the frozen Adrian with a great leap. His claws aimed for the man's neck, ready to rip his head off. A few feet from touching him, his pupils suddenly shrank and all his hair stood on end. A cold sweat covered his body and made him start to shiver. The man's scarlet eyes still reflected Steve's figure, clearly still possessed. But something was terribly wrong. On the man's frozen face, the corners of his lips had lifted slightly. His possessed gaze focused on Jason. Even though his hand was slowly closing on his neck, Jason felt that he was the one being choked. No. No. Something's wrong. Wrong. The werewolf's bestial mind shrieked in horror and he tried to stop his assault, but he was already in midair less than 5 feet away from the grinning redhead. He felt like a bug about to fall into the spider's trap. Within 50 centimeters of his claws making contact with the man's neck, Jason suddenly found himself suspended in midair. A ridiculous expression on his face as he looked at Adrian's smiling face in dread. Invisible threads covered the red-haired man's entire front in a complicated and effective spider's web. These same threads now completely covered the body of the werewolf, who had an expression of absolute terror. No sooner had that happened, the red-haired man's body was suddenly engulfed in golden flames, and the next instant, a Steve completely covered in the same golden flames came out of them. Ah! The wraith shrieked in pure agony as he felt the holy fire burn all his flesh. The man began to writhe on the ground a few feet away from them. The man tried to crawl further to try to recover and deal with the flames, but a large amount of threads covered his legs and prevented any movement. But Jason's attention was not on his fallen leader but on the figure covered again in the golden armor that had one fist extended backward. His free hand tapped his palm twice. The helmet's scarlet eyes glowed with enormous satisfaction and a deep, mocking voice came out of it. Gotcha. A powerful explosive fist covered in white fire with golden flashes connected squarely in the middle of the werewolf's face, right in the red zone that appeared as soon as he ignited his spiritual vision. Jason's head and most of his upper torso exploded in a shower of blood. Adrian then took a mighty leap and descended with power upon the badly wounded Steve. His feet centered in the red zone on the man's back. Steve looked up with eyes like plates at this. He raised his hand and quickly tried to form a wall of ice. Boom. Doctor, a healed tire, and Joseph, who were running towards the trio, stopped dead in their tracks. Their stunned and disbelieving expressions as they looked at the back of the knight of golden flames, who turned his head slightly towards them. Chunks of flesh fell around him in a shower of gore and blood, the crimson droplets boiling and evaporating as soon as they came too close to the armor. The cold scarlet eyes of the helmet looked down at them. In a deep, heavy voice, like war drums beating on a battlefield, Adrian said. Next. The doctor gritted his teeth and a vein began to throb in his neck. His fists clenched tightly and blood began to fall from them. He always knew where Steve was. He just acted like he didn't know to set a trap and he'd end up with 2 of us. The plan that had worked so many times before against dozens of opponents was easily seen and used completely against them. All the effort they had made to hold out for those 3 minutes had been in vain. The artifact had not broken. It had all been a hoax. A trap. The man had used the arrogance they had because of the numerical advantage and the belief that it was a race against the clock and exploited it to his advantage. Is this the same man as before? We had the numerical advantage. So why did it feel like they were the ones being beaten? That went a lot better than I had planned. Adrian thought calmly as he looked at the remains of Steve and Jason. Steve hiding in the ice was a little too obvious. He did that when he ambushed me in my house. Same with what they wanted to do. I was hoping to take advantage of that and kill one of them. I didn't expect to kill Steve as well. That was a surprise. It seems that receiving attacks from the path of the sun in his wraith state is several times worse than receiving it in his physical body. Shaking his head internally, Adrian looked at the quivering form of the doctor, who looked about to have a seizure. This caused him enormous satisfaction that he was quick to show, the satisfaction that only grew as he felt a significant portion of his potion being digested at once. That was a very good warm-up, Doc. I already feel my muscles well stretched. Sorry about your friends, though. Looks like they couldn't hold up to the dancing and had to take a little break. But fear not, I'm sure you'll see them soon enough. Rolling his shoulders, the man let out a chuckle as he shook his head. Well, that doesn't matter. I still have 3 dance partners. Please don't disappoint me again, will you? I'll be very sad if you fall as easily as these two. To add more gasoline to the flame, Adrian kicked a considerably large piece of meat that had survived. Ads by PubFuture. Joseph and Tyre began to shake with barely contained anger, both wanting more than anything to go tear the man in front of them apart with their bare hands. The only thing keeping them bound was the doctor, who even he was having trouble controlling himself. Letting out a sigh to calm himself, the doctor felt the red mist that threatened to blind him recede. Never mind. Never mind. It's almost over. Letting out another sigh, the doctor let out a chuckle as he shook his head. You almost made me lose my mind, Mr. Kenway. It's been a long time since that happened. What do you want me to say? I have a talent for that. A pretty big one if I can make cockroaches like you lose something they never had. Adrian replied in amusement as he looked at the trio. The flames engulfing him danced lightly as if accompanying their master in mockery. You. The thin, ugly brow quivered and another blue vein began to throb vigorously in his pale, sickly skin. The doctor looked much worse than before, now resembling a dried corpse than a human being. And the odor he gave off was stronger than before, now smelling like a rotting corpse in an advanced state of decomposition. It was as if his life force was being depleted and fast. I was right. Whatever his way of healing is, it takes a heavy toll on his body. It was a good idea to force him to take on more of a healing role than an attacking one. That way I wear him down without having to risk finding out what else this unknown path can do. Satisfied that his experiment worked, Adrian relaxed and tensed his body in preparation. The vitality of this pathway should not be underestimated. He completely blew his head off and the body could still move and even regenerate from that. That was levels beyond what a normal sequence 5 can survive. Now the doctor would be forced to take the role of attacker. He was sure that if he kept healing Dutch's body it would not hold much longer. It looks like they are about to lose their minds. This is the best time to do our part. Flora said seriously and quite tired. Stealing a sequence 5 skill was very draining. She could already feel herself falling asleep at any moment, but she resisted. Nodding inwardly, the redhead took a step. Tap tap crack. Fush. At the third, the ground at his feet cracked and Wach accelerated him towards the group. The doctor and Jason summoned their respective weapons at this and Tyre unconsciously took a step back. Letting out a chuckle at the man's reaction, Adrian snapped his fingers. From his fire armor came multiple golden ravens that lashed out at the trio still standing. A small smirk came from under his helmet as a golden fireball formed in his right hand and he extended his arm out to the side. The fireball quickly began to expand and gained a white color but still retained some golden tongues. It quickly expanded until it was bigger than him and as big as a house. Wasting no time, he hurled it at the trio with a loud laugh. Get them, little one. The attack that looked more like a small meteorite left a cascade of destruction in its wake. Golden trenches where it passed through. Growling in annoyance, the doctor raised his scythe and slashed the air. A new sickle of energy shot out of it and sliced the huge fireball in half, and continued its onslaught against the knight. Delicate red eyebrows rose slightly as he felt his connection to the ball being severed as it exploded to the sides in streams of golden fire. Adrian, who stepped to the side, calmly dodged the sickle that brushed past him. Looking at what became of his attack, the red-haired man just laughed in delight. Oh silly, that won't be enough. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers with an amused grin. Snap. The flame trenches left over from the golden meteor shook and trembled for an instant before a huge golden flock of crows flew at them at high speed. Gritting his teeth, Joseph opened his mouth and foul language came out of it. Slow. The onslaught of the flock of crows suddenly slowed, which allowed the trio to dodge, but Doctor, not wanting the same thing to happen as before, raised his hand and clenched his fist. An enormous amount of black ivy came out of the ground and grabbed the crows in mid-flight like snakes. The ivies shrieked in pain as they touched the holy fire, but obeying their master's will, they cut down and destroyed the birds. The doctor's eyes were not only focused on the slaughter of the flock of crows but also on the knight in the background, who now held in his hands a bow burning with a white arrow. Adrian smiled as he released his fingers. The arrow flew in a straight line with enormous speed, being only a blur. It passed through the black ivy vines and flew on. Its target reacted quickly and raised his magma sword in front of him. Pam. Crack. The arrow connected, and contrary to what Joseph expected, it exploded in a torrent of flames instead of an explosion. His sense of danger screamed and he unconsciously turned his head to the side, his ear and part of his horn falling to the ground thanks to the flaming sword that came out of the torrent of flames. Emerging from the torrent of flames and with a sword in both hands, the knight laughed madly. Controlled by his sixth sense, Joseph raised his arm and blocked a kick to the same side of his face. Boom! The kick connected with a concentrated explosion and Joseph was sent flying into the trunk accompanied by a scream of pain, the explosion having blown off part of his face and destroyed his left eye. The doctor and zombie Tyre tried to stop the assault but Adrian ignored them and focused all his attention on the demon. His only response to their combined attack was for his armor to glow again. Did you learn nothing? Adrian said with clear disappointment. Boom! From the black cloud caused by the explosion, multiple fireballs chased Joseph, who was barely rising from the ground as he held his face and breathed raggedly, his back to the edge of the crater. Multiple veins pulsed in his neck and his scowl was as deep as the darkest abysses. Huff, huff, huff. Ken Nnwy why. Seeing the heavy attack coming at him, Devil Joseph screamed furiously, a red mist slightly blinding his vision and clouding his judgment. Several green fireballs smelling of ammonia appeared behind him, 5 in total. Their size larger than the ones coming against him. These balls flew into the air and went against the golden fireballs, ready to destroy them and lunge at his enemy. Before hitting the first golden fireball, it suddenly expanded and through it came out the knight facing the ammonia balls. A mad laughter accompanied him as the green of the balls took on a reddish color. These reddish-green balls did a spin in the air and flew with power towards the demon, who looked at this with his pupils picked out. Are you such an idiot? How can you use fire against me? No wonder your family is so disappointed in you. You nameless devil. Adrian shouted with all the mockery he could muster, finally using the information he had on Joseph to his fullest advantage. Since meeting him face to face, Adrian had noticed how this one, despite always mentioning his family's heritage, never mentioned his last name. And not only that, when the red-haired man provoked him with being a disgrace to his family, the man had reacted in an extremely impulsive manner. As far as he knew from the original history and theories of some crazy fasts, a devil's surname was the pride and blood of a devil. Not having it could be considered a complete disgrace, as it meant you were not recognized by the family. Of course, it's just a theory made by a bunch of lonely people with too much time for themselves and not much of a social life. But even they can be really useful. Adrian thought with a grin as he raised a hand, his eyes locked into a completely frozen devil. A golden ball of fire formed in his hand and it quickly began to shrink. The mist that slightly tinged Joseph's vision became a curtain of boiling blood. His vision turned red and reason left him. I'm going to kill you, you piece of shit. His huge body took the man's fireballs head on and his own, gaining even more wounds, but nothing mattered. His sense of danger was completely drowned by the sea of red that was his anger. In his current state, nothing mattered to Joseph, who, ignoring the pain of his wounds, lunged at the knight head on. Joseph, no. You fucking idiot. The doctor shouted angrily as he tried to get up after receiving the blast, his appearance even worse than before, with his eyes extremely sunken in and his skin breaking and peeling like paper, showing the rotting, putrid flesh underneath. He was about to take a shadowy leap to stop the crazed man, but just as he was about to do so, a horrible sound made him want to cover his ears. Chi! An extremely high-pitched screeching sound began to echo through the cavern, coming from the fireball that was compressing even more, going from being as big as a basketball to being just like a small ball and just kept getting smaller and smaller. His spirituality warned him of the enormous danger of that attack. He was sure that if Joseph received it full on, he was going to die. Not wanting to lose any more men, as it would only make dealing with Kenway that much harder. The doctor rushed into the shadows head first. Reappearing to the side of the devil without reason, he pushed him out of the way and they were both quickly covered by the shadows. In the second it took for their bodies to be covered by the shadows, the doctor and the knight found themselves facing each other again. The latter pointed his arm at the duo, and in the palm of it a small sphere of light, barely bigger than a ping-pong ball and still shrinking, let out a horrible screeching sound. Seeing such an attack so close and being in the sight of it, the little that remained of the doctor's skin bristled. Fear along with enormous confusion was born in him. If being so close to it did that to him, why didn't Joseph, who is a devil, move out of the way? No matter how crazy and out of his mind he was. If something threatened his life, the devil would abandon all sense of attack and dodge it or run away from that danger. The current Joseph made no sense. Then why? Eyes widened in recognition and the doctor looked to the side, to where the womb was throbbing in the middle of the crater. Immediately realizing the man's true purpose, the doctor could only watch helplessly as the red-haired man's white sphere hand moved from them to the uterus. See you never, bitch. Grinning madly and holding his arm that was shaking hard. Adrian stopped holding the sphere and shot. The screeching stopped and an extremely thin line of highly concentrated energy shot out of his palm. This beam of energy crossed the 40 meters of the lake with extreme ease and struck the womb. The inside of it was glowing for an instant before a golden explosion blew it into 1,000 pieces. Dense black smoke covered the womb area. Ha 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 ha. Adrian laughed madly. The plan had worked perfectly. His goal had never been to kill the quintet. It had always been to damage the core. He just wanted them to focus all their attention on attacking him instead of protecting the core to get a window. For a second, Adrian found himself somewhat confused. Why hadn't Chicho shown up already? He had destroyed the core outright. His eyes widened as realization hit him. He had destroyed the uterus, but he didn't know if he had hit what was inside it. Adrian's body suddenly froze, his pupils shrank and he found himself unable to think. His mind was completely clouded. A horrible and incredibly heavy presence made its presence known in the cave. From the black smoke that made up the womb, a hand of red flesh emerged. With disgusting thick hairs sticking out of it and thorns piercing its flesh. The hand was very thick, with stubby, somewhat short fingers. It looked like a baby's hand. Wah! The cry of a newborn sounded in the cave. High in the empty backland sky, black storm clouds began to fill everything. An enormous amount of lightning began to rumble in these, completely humiliating Ace Snake's lightning bolts, who looked at this in shock while Saturna looked at it with a huge smile. Craboom, 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 craboom. With thunder roaming around and floating at the top of the tree and completely invisible to the two demigods, a woman dressed in ancient clothing and carrying a metal box in her arms looked at all that was happening with serene crimson eyes. Wah! The thing's high-pitched, repulsive, hideous scream echoed through the cave. It resonated and struck directly at the minds and souls of everyone present. A deadly sickle that strikes deep within the individual, wounding them in the worst possible way. Horrible ravings pounded into the knight's mind, their intensity so great that the red-haired man felt his sanity slip from his grasp for an instant and fall into an abyss. The Sunfire's armor cracked and shattered almost completely, the webbing of the threads breaking with a resounding, high-pitched, SAP. Along with all the surrounding threads. Horrible wounds appeared where the red-haired man's body had been left unprotected. Protruding wounds, muscles contracting and expanding in hideous and disgusting ways, like hearts growing out from under the skin. Adrian's vision was almost completely stained a hideous crimson, his eyes filled with blood until they nearly exploded, the veins in them pulsing grotesquely like maggots. Thick tears of blood streamed not only from his eyes but also from his nose, ears, and mouth. Black veins throbbed beneath his skin, ready to explode, and the skin itself took on a greenish-black hue, as if beneath Adrian's skin was a tree trying to pull up its roots but failing miserably. How are you holding up, princess? You can still move, can't you? Flora asked in alarm as she saw what was happening to the redhead's body. She was immensely relieved that the screams weren't getting through to her. He wasn't wrong when he said that nothing would happen to me as long as I was inside him. Bit busy, Adrian growled, clutching his mind with all his might. Wah! The thing continued screaming as if to show its enormous frustration at being born prematurely. The scream was filled with hatred and resentment towards the culprit. Chi! But a sound was drowned out underneath that loud and annoying scream. A soft chirping that struggled to overcome the screaming. The golden armor was trying to regenerate itself, but the incessant wailing of the creature was making the process immensely difficult. Every time it did regenerate, it would shortly break again. The previous wounds, which had regained their natural color, returned to their black-green color. Chi. Ha ha. Huff. Ha ha. Huff. Ha 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 ha. A tired, excited laugh escaped his bloodied lips, accompanied by ragged, labored breaths. Despite the horrible mutations and injuries to his body, Adrian still held his right arm up, supported by his left. A ball of white fire with flashes of gold in his palm shrank rapidly as it let out a faint shriek. His eyes, almost completely red with blood, struggled to see the fleshy hand emerging from the smoke. Bloodshot teeth showed in the maniacal grin on the red-haired man's bloody face. If you think that's enough to stop me, you don't know me. The redhead thought madly as he quickly charged another plasma beam. While his soul was at its most sensitive since he awoke in this body, after so many experiences with the ravings of the greatest rapper, and the most recent one just moments ago, his body was now that of Sequence 6, the Talk Millennium chant that strengthened him even more, and added that the armor had taken much of the damage. He could still fight. Ha, ha, huff, huff, huff. But even with all the layers of protection he had, the proximity to the scream made the damage still severe. I can feel it. I can feel my mind slipping away every moment that little shit breathes. At this point, I will lose control soon. No. I am losing control now. Not only could Adrian feel himself falling into an endless abyss, but he could also feel something inside him dying, being ripped out and brutally murdered slowly and painfully. The intense emotions he had felt since the ambush of the 5 mockers began to die, replaced by a cold and cruel indifference. Soon, he would revert to the former Adrian, and this time, he wasn't sure he could come back from it. He would be no different from a devil, or even worse, for at least those bats took pleasure in tormenting humans. The Adrian that came out would find no pleasure in anything, he would be an empty vessel. The very thought of what he would be capable of without a moral. Huff, huff, ha, ha ha, huff, 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 ha ha, what does it matter now? A mad cackle erupted from the depths of his damaged and battered soul, his smile sharpening to the point that it could cut through the hardest metal. That he was not only losing control but his emotions as well. That he would soon no longer be himself. Why did it matter? More than 30 million lives rest on his back right now. This was not the time to be a bitch. As long as I give you a scratch, I'll gladly give you everything I am. Adrian roared as the intensity of the screeching in his right palm increased. He could feel the regeneration repairing the damage to his body caused by the screaming, he could deal with the out of control and lack of emotion later. The priority was to damage that thing, no matter what. A normal attack wouldn't work on this thing. He was sure of that. He could see that despite the seemingly soft red flesh that made up the arm, it was too hard. Only another plasma beam could damage it. Adrian, watch out. Before the attack could be fully charged, Flora's alarmed voice howled in his mind, and the red-haired man's bloodshot eyes widened in surprise. Severe. An inhuman voice, and what seemed to be more than one voice, roared from beside him as the doctor stepped out of the shadows like a bolt of lightning, wielding a new crimson scythe, the blade emitting red sparks. He can still move. Adrian stared in disbelief as the sickle struck the palm of his hand where the orb of light was. Boom mmmmm. A huge explosion erupted as the sphere of light lost its balance. 2 plumes of smoke emerged from the explosion, and 2 bodies hit the ground hard. The screaming stopped the moment the sphere exploded, distracting whatever was behind the smoke. Shit. Adrian grunted, his face on the ground, a ringing in his ear, and a slight burning in his right arm. His right eye was closed. No, he could feel the emptiness in it. And his other eye was no better, he could see a white patch. The corners of his remaining good eye were stained black, but clenching his teeth, he clung to consciousness with all his might. Not yet. Not yet. Adrian tried to use his arm to get up, but his body did not respond. Get up. Get up. Adrian grunted in enormous frustration as he tried to use his head for support, but even that cost him too much. Princess. Your bones. Flora's heavy voice said wearily, every single one of them is broken. The red-haired man's body was twisted and ruined, the armor completely gone, revealing the man's slightly burnt and stunted clothes. There were fractures in places where white bone protruded all over his back, arms, and legs. By far, the worst wound was his right arm. His right hand was gone, replaced by a stump with a broken white bone protruding from it. Blood was gushing out in ridiculous quantities, already forming a large stain beneath him. Gritting his teeth, Adrian summoned some of the fire armor once more to cover him. I can't let them know that I can regenerate. Refusing to lose his trump card, Adrian grunted as he felt the rib that had pierced his lung slowly return to its place. His regeneration had slowed considerably, now the bones were returning to their place much more slowly than Adrian could afford. The stump that was his hand began to twist and grow, slowly covering the exposed bone that was also recovering. You need to wait a few seconds for the regeneration to work. I don't have a few seconds. Adrian cut the demi-goddess off as he tried to get up again with his injured arm, strands coming out of his body and wrapping around the bones coming out of it and all the others. Snap, snap, snap. With a resounding and sickly snap and snap, the threads forced the bones back into place, eliciting a grunt from the red-haired man. No longer having to worry about getting the bones back into place, the regeneration sped up a little and began to restore the damaged flesh and organs. With both eyes regenerated, he looked down at the ground with blurred vision. He could barely make out his hands. Huff huff. A gasp left him, and swallowing some of his blood to soothe his dry throat, Adrian stood shakily. The feeling of broken bones being held violently in place by his strings made him grunt again, but he ignored the enormous pain it caused him and took a step. Not yet, he murmured with cold but determined eyes as he looked at the spot where the doctor had exploded his attack. Obeying his will, golden fire and more threads emerged from his body, enveloping him and forming his armor, only the process was much slower than before. He looked around for Joseph and Tyre, but he couldn't see them anywhere. This only made him more anxious. Where are those bastards? Tap tap. A body that could not even be described as human appeared from the rubble where he was standing. It wobbled a little as it moved. All the skin was gone, along with the white suit, which was reduced to rags. The blackish muscle was so thin that Adrian could see the bone. His face was gone, leaving only crooked teeth and extremely sunken and completely black eyes. One of his arms was completely gone, and the remaining one held the scythe, which now had a slight golden sheen on the tip. The doctor, now looking more like dried flesh, raised his bony hand with the scythe towards Adrian, whose face was covered by his golden helmet. To the knight's surprise, the bony hand brought the golden blade of the scythe close to the doctor's face. A voice, no, a heavy, soft murmur, left his lipless mouth, spirituality speaking the words his ruined mouth could no longer utter. Harvest. Crack, crack, crack. Suddenly, all the armor covering Adrian shattered like glass. He died as quickly as a sail falling into the sea. A look of disbelief on his face as his eyebrows rose to touch his red hair. He immediately jumped back to gain more distance as he tried to summon his armor again but found himself unable. His control over the fire had been severed. It doesn't matter. The separation will only last a few seconds. I just have to hold on. Adrian could barely think of that as a huge cut appeared on his chest, quickly gushing out a large amount of blood. His body staggered a little from the sudden cut before another appeared on his face, cutting an eye, then on his arm, leg, torso, and feet. From 1 second to the next, Adrian's entire body had been cut. Behind the red-haired man, the shadows boiled slightly and grew, two blurs emerging from them and shooting towards him. Joseph and Tyre, the former having carried Tyre through the shadows, rushed towards him. Both with tears of blood and red eyes, the weeping had affected them too. Don't you know what one-on-one is? The red-haired man growled in frustration. His one eye burned with anger. Even though he was covered in severe cuts, he moved deftly, ignoring the pain of the cuts, gushing a ridiculous amount of blood as stitches began to close them in an attempt to aid regeneration. Adrian leapt backward, dodging the missile that was the zombie that crashed and shattered the ground. A layer of ice began to spread from his feet, making it difficult for him to move. Turning, Adrian barely managed to dodge the slash of the devil's magma sword, which shattered the ground at his feet, incapacitating him but also destroying the layer of ice. Not wanting to give himself another window to be attacked, the red-haired man opened his mouth. Another wraith shriek attacked Joseph's spirit body, whose eyes began to weep blood, and he froze. Not missing the opportunity, threads manifested around Adrian and wrapped around the demon, trapping him as a powerful fist connected with his stomach, knocking all the air out of the devil and making him spit blood. Adrian followed up with an uppercut to Joseph's chin, lifting the demon a few inches into the air along with some bloody sharp teeth. Adrian tightened the threads around Joseph, strengthening them with his spirituality, and grabbed them with his right hand, throwing the devil at a still staggering Tyre. Both collided and fell to the ground, and Adrian reached out to them with his open palm and focused his spirituality on the Talk Millennium in his stomach. Even if he didn't have his fire, he still had other means of attack. Slash. Plop. Adrian coughed up blood and lowered his one good, stunned eye to the crimson blade shooting from the center of his chest. He could feel it piercing his heart. Shit. Flora cursed loudly at the scene before her. The doctor, still half in Adrian's shadow, looked at the man he had sliced through with a dark gleam in his black eyes. Son of a bitch, Adrian said haltingly, blood dripping from his mouth. His strength was quickly leaving him and the blackness at the corners of his eyes was growing. Without your golden armor in the way, the shadows can finally touch you, the doctor's voice repeated in a dark echo. A black tongue flicked out, and the man licked his yellowed teeth. With a wet sound, the scythe continued its slash and came out of the red-haired man's right hip, tearing everything in its path. A large amount of blood flowed from the wound, but instead of falling to the ground, it was absorbed by the scythe and more of Adrian's strength went with it. Now he could barely stand. A powerful kick sent him flying toward a smiling Tyre and Joseph. An ice-covered fist connected with his knee, knocking him into one, followed by a punch to the side of his face, knocking out several teeth. Ice began to spread from the impact zones, along with a black smear. After this brief assault, the zombie retreated, and the devil's claws grabbed and sank into the redhead's neck, choking him and nearly breaking his neck. Ah! With a scream of hatred, Joseph lifted Adrian's body and slammed it into the ground, shattering the stone and taking the air out of his lungs. The devil lifted the magma sword in his hand and brought it down with great force. Plam! Molten, sharp rock pierced the red-haired man's chest, and Adrian coughed up a great deal of blood with his eyes wide open. The sword passed completely through him and sank deep into the rock beneath him. Not satisfied with having destroyed the man's chest, Joseph, still holding the neck of a stiff Adrian, squeezed hard and sank his claws as deep as he could into the man's throat. Then, he pulled his claws out with great force, tearing the man's throat completely apart. Adrian's lips opened and moved slightly, no sound escaping from them, just a bloody regurgitation. He tried to raise his head, but almost as soon as he did, it lost its strength and fell back to the ground. Ads by PubFuture. Everything seemed to stop at that moment. Joseph held the burning hilt of his sword for a few seconds before releasing it, staggering a little and straightening his back with great difficulty. He stared with empty eyes at the fallen knight's body, who had a lost gaze staring blankly into the void. His throat was torn and spurting blood. Adrian lay limp on the ground with a melted magma sword through his chest and stuck in the rock. Ha! Ha! He! Unable to contain himself any longer, Joseph dropped the sword and backed up a few steps, completely out of breath. His skin turned pale, and his musculature shrank, returning to a normal human appearance. Huff! 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 Thud! As he fell to his knees with almost no strength left, Joseph could barely keep himself from passing out. His entire body was covered in severe burns, and he could feel several of his bones broken, with one piercing his lung. But despite the pain, a huge, tetric smile graced his face. He's dead, the demon said with difficulty. The zombie that staggered over to him froze for a moment, his expression showing surprise and disbelief. As if he didn't quite believe what the man had said. Tyre looked down at the limp body a few feet away from Joseph, a mad grin growing on his face as he began to shake slightly. Ha ha ha, finally. For a moment, I thought he was going to kill us. Tyre laughed in relief as he fell to the ground, completely exhausted. The doctor looked at all this and said nothing, his black eyes shining with satisfaction. The crimson scythe in his hands lost its shine and went limp, then turned liquid and began to enter the doctor's body, whose black muscles gained a little more color but still retained their rotting appearance. A childish giggle echoed through the cave, and despite their wounds, the three men rose and knelt before the fleshy arm, their backs to the body. O divine vessel, please forgive us for not being able to protect you. We will do anything to be forgiven for our terrible sin. The doctor begged, his forehead touching the ground. Tears of sadness fell from his eyes as he failed to achieve his goal. As she hovered over the blood tree, watching what was happening within its deep roots, a single tear trickled down her cheek. A soft sigh escaped her lips. Her crimson eyes shone with a slight disappointment, drowned out by a great sadness. Another failure, she whispered and closed her eyes in resignation. The worst-case scenario had happened. Backlund has fallen. Even with her eyes closed, a delicate hand slid over the soft, cold metal of the box in her arms. She opened her eyes again, which were now pure ice. Her mouth opened. A small exclamation of surprise left her beautiful lips, crimson eyes glowing with emotion, melting the coldness of before. The battle at the roots wasn't over yet. Seeing that the guard of the trio in front of them had completely disappeared, Flora roared, "Now Adryan." The scarlet eye that had stared into the lost nothingness suddenly regained its edge. Gritting his teeth as he felt the fiery blade buried in his chest, several threads began to wrap around his arms and legs. Strengthening these threads and concentrating, Adryan focused on this one action. No other thoughts in his mind, just one. To get up. He couldn't feel anything from his neck down, the magma sword had destroyed his spine. But being paralyzed didn't mean he couldn't move in other ways. Using his strings and strengthening them with more spirituality, his fingers trembled one moment, and his feet planted on the ground the next. As if his body were a puppet, he rose from the ground without using his arms. The magma sword continued its path, sinking deeper and deeper into his chest until it pierced him completely, leaving Adryan completely bent over. A huge fiery hole burned and smoked in his chest, but it was already closing. Without waiting for his spine to regenerate, he controlled his body to lunge at his nearest enemy. Joseph's closed eyes snapped open. His expression bathed in fear from the sense of danger that screamed so loudly it left a slight ringing in his ears. Before he could react to the impending danger, a weight fell onto his back. Legs wrapped around his waist and arms locked around his neck, nails digging deep into his face and scalp. With one of his lungs largely regenerated and the hole in his throat closed, Adryan let out a hollow laugh. "Thanks for warming me up, Joseph. I was getting a bit cold." The familiar but rather hoarse voice whispered in his ear, and the demon paled. "No," the man whispered in complete shock. "You don't mind if I return the favor?" Adryan asked with a bloody smile, blood dripping from his mouth. Hearing the new voice, Tyre and the doctor turned to watch the scene in shock. Adryan just winked at them with a single tired eye. The next second, his and Joseph's bodies burst into golden flames, turning them both into a holy bonfire that burned away all that was unclean and sinful. Ah! The intensity of the flames muffled Joseph's terrible howl of agony. The devil slammed his elbow desperately into the redhead's stomach as he tried to free his neck. The doctor and Tyre reacted immediately. The former summoned a massive amount of ivy and his blood scythe, while the latter took several steps back in utter horror. He wasn't dead. He had a huge hole in his chest. How can he still be alive? The zombie screamed in horror, earning an extremely annoyed look from the doctor, who was about to reprimand him. Wah! Wah! Black blood poured from his eyes and the fleshman fell to his knees, his scythe breaking as he fell to the ground without support as Tyre lay sprawled on the ground and began to convulse. The child's cry sounded annoyed and extremely frustrated, the current development causing it great discomfort. Wah! Wah! The golden bonfire trembled and shrank, fluttering like a candle in a storm, but unlike the candle, the bonfire did not go out. Blood dripped from his eyes, but the smile on Adryan's face remained exultant. "If I keep a thick layer of fire around me, no matter how much you cry, you won't be able to hurt me as much as you did before, you failed abortion." Adryan laughed very pleasedly as he increased the flames around him. At the same time the baby cried louder, "Don't worry, little one. You're next." Joseph fell to his knees and continued to scream in pain, trying to whip his back against the floor in an attempt to free himself from the red head on his back, but he couldn't even do that as he was almost completely immobilized by the threads wrapped around him. No matter how desperate his attempts or how deep his nails dug into the flesh of the arm at his neck, Adryan would not let go. He had become the fly that fell prey to the spider and was being devoured. "What's the matter? Don't you want to get some sun?" Adryan laughed with extreme malice. Joseph's only reaction was to howl even louder. His skin melted, and the tears of blood that fell from his face were turned to ashes by the holy fire. The desire to transform and try to escape was great, but Joseph knew it was a terrible idea. The transformation would turn him into a complete devil, a being of filth and sin. A being that was incredibly weak to the flames of the sun. Becoming a devil now would mean certain death. At least if he kept his human form, he would have a chance to escape. Gritting his teeth, Joseph tried to raise his hands to the red-haired man's face, but the movement was too slow. Threads covered his arm, making it difficult to move and causing the man to fall further into the abyss. His skin not only began to melt but to crack, releasing a black liquid that was removed by the holy fire. His eyes sharpened like a snake's, and blood began to drip from them. He had fallen into the abyss and was about to lose control. I don't understand. How is he still alive? I destroyed his heart, his lungs, and his spine. Even if he survives the first two, he shouldn't be able to move. Joseph completely lost his composure. His heart was beating incredibly fast and he felt his mind overwhelmed and clumsy. Why didn't he kill him when he destroyed his chest? No human could survive that. The more he thought about it, the less sense it made. How could this have happened? Was it necessary to really kill him to cut off his head? Why didn't I cut off his head? Why did I settle for destroying his chest when I could have crushed his skull? How could I have been so careless? The words spoken before the battle began were recalled to the devil's mind, the man's nearly melted eyes widening in shock as the realization hit him. His stomach sank, along with any sense or desire to fight. The man had somehow planted the idea of going for the heart and ignoring the head. That's why his master went for the heart instead of the head when he attacked the bastard from behind. From the beginning of the battle, we were in the palm of his hand. The feeling in his body left him at the same time as his vision was lost as his eyes melted completely. Monster, Joseph muttered, drawing an insanely pleased chuckle from the redhead. Coming from you, that's a compliment. Princess, I know you want to make him pay, but we don't have that luxury now. You need to kill him quickly. Flora reminded the redhead, who let out a grunt before nodding slightly. No matter how much he wanted to make Joseph suffer, Adrian knew he couldn't waste time with his revenge. So he quickly moved his hands to the demon's head. And with all his strength, enhanced by Talk Millennium, he twisted it around. Crack. Joseph's neck snapped with a resounding crack, but not content with that, Adrian formed fiery claws and plunged them into Joseph's skull, injecting a large amount of holy fire directly into his brain, causing tongues of flame to shoot out of the empty sockets in his head to shatter. Plop. Blood and gray matter covered Adrian's face, but it was reduced to ashes by the fire that engulfed him the next moment. His scarlet eyes glowed coldly as he watched the headless corpse fall to the ground with a thud. A few seconds later, the demon's body was reduced to black ashes, with only a few scraps of clothing remaining. A foot stepped on the remains of the clothes, which burned and turned to ash. The black ash did not disperse but began to collect, and after a few moments, a jet stone was formed from the ash. The man's empty scarlet eyes pierced the souls of the duo before him as he grasped the jet stone. Adrian immediately felt his emotions fading further, but he ignored it. Considerable ravings assaulted his mind, but Adrian ignored them. He was used to worse. He imbued the stone with his spirituality and it quickly turned a fiery red. In the next instant, a magma blade formed in Adrian's hand as his musculature swelled slightly, but just as quickly returned to normal, black smoke billowing from his body. His fire gloves, along with the mesh of his threads, kept him from being burned by the lava's touch. Princess, I don't recommend it. Using the characteristics directly is very dangerous, the negative effects could be fatal. Flora commented, but the man just shook his head gently. It's all right. I can handle it. At this point, everything is useful. Even this junk. Adrian muttered as he clenched the sword tightly in his hand. The mere touch of it gave him both disgust and enormous satisfaction, disgust at who it belonged to and satisfaction that this monster was already dead. Flora, do you think you can steal a second power? His lips twitched slightly, but no sound came out. I'm not sure. I think so. What do you want to do with? Quickly realizing what the man was about to do, Flora grunted uncomfortably, I can try. But success will depend on what you know about this thing. And if it works, I'll undoubtedly pass out. It could easily take me several months to recover. Do you think you can survive that long without me? Nodding inwardly, Adrian squeezed the hilt tightly. I'm counting on you, Miss Worm. If this works, try to stay out of trouble until I come back, alright? I'm tired of waking up to find you role-playing weird sexual games with your enemies. Hey, no promises. Adrian let out a small chuckle and nodded slightly. Flora snorted, I saw that coming. The campfire around him faded as his armor reformed. He was finally visible to the two men, who tensed at the sight. He raised the magma sword in his hand and pointed it at them with a mocking laugh. Blood dripped from his eyes at the sound of the baby's cry. Well, who will be my new dance partner? His voice sounded much darker than usual, with a sinister and malevolent edge to it as he used Joseph's characteristics directly. He grinned wickedly, his face covered by the golden helmet, scarlet eyes burning into it. Wah, 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 crack. At the baby's cries, half of his helmet shattered, revealing half of his face. Tears of blood streamed from his eyes and nose, his face extremely pale from the loss of blood and black circles under his eyes. Despite the obvious weariness and exhaustion on his face, the predatory grin that showed his sharp teeth chilled Tyre's blood. I promise I won't be gentle, Adrian said with a sideways grin that the eye in his helmet replied to. His helmet fully regenerated, but it showed some cracks, as did the rest of his armor. Now that the smoke no longer covered it, Adrian could get a good look at the owner of that grotesque arm. Like the others, its entire body was skinless, and he could see the red muscle beneath it. Deformed, throbbing muscles with black hairs growing out of them, like weeds eating away at the walls over time. Its other arm was ridiculously small, clearly a deformity from being born prematurely. Its torso was swollen, with black veins throbbing and pumping pure filth. Its legs were fused into some sort of fleshy, abnormal fishtail, but where the fin should have been, a tube of flesh connected it to the tree, and it seemed to be pumping food into it. Worst of all was the poor imitation head it had, which was ridiculously large and badly deformed in comparison to the body. Its eyes were too small and clouded with a sickly, disgusting purple. Its nose was non-existent, with only a tiny hole where it should be. Its mouth was ridiculously large and ran down its neck to the middle of its chest. This mouth was filled with razor-sharp teeth and a long thin tongue. What disgusted Adrian the most was not the brutal and disgusting appearance of the baby, who appeared to be the bastard child that Resident Evil and Silent Hill had made on a moonless night, heavily intoxicated and on various drugs, and whose mother had spent the 9 months injecting horse urine into her veins before giving birth in a sewer, abandoning the little abomination there, later rescued by mutant rats who raised it as one of their own. No, what disgusted the redhead most was that half of its body was covered in reproductive organs, all female. To add to the bizarre image before him, each one was contracting and making its own sounds as it spat out something resembling nectar. His eyes were drawn away from the creature and onto the last of the enemies in front of him. Doctor was standing but staggering slightly, while the zombie looked frozen, with a great deal of blood pouring from its eyes and mouth. At this rate, he'll lose control soon. Oh ho ho, I have an idea. Adrian smiled mischievously as he licked his lips, his helmet coming off to reveal his face. Turning his attention back to the mutant baby, he let out a snort and shook his head with a clear expression of disgust. TCH. So you're a girl, huh? The baby's crying stopped for a moment. His hideous face crinkled in confusion. Quickly raising his magma sword, Adrian swung it aside, blocking the crimson energy sickle. He then raised it high and blocked the slash of an enraged doctor. What do you think you're doing, Kenway? Ignoring the clearly angry man, Adrian let out a chuckle, and his armor blinked. The doctor's eyes flashed with alarm. Boom. Adrian used his threads to put his bones back together, shouting at the baby as he dodged the attack of the hideous-looking zombie Tyre. You certainly got the looks out of your bitch of a mother. I can see from here how cheap and easy it is. That whore must be really proud of you. Look at the party she threw. Quite the baby shower. Adrian sneered as he clicked his tongue, a spear forming in his free hand. A spear that left his hand the next second. Tyre could barely form a weak dome of ice that could not withstand the impact and explosion of the spear. The baby let out a few grunts, and reddish slime dripped from its bizarre mouth. The black veins in its body swelled and throbbed. Swinging his arm to the side, the flat of the magma sword blocked the lunge of the crimson scythe. Raising his elbow, he blocked the doctor's furious blow, which, despite being more bone than flesh, had lost little of its power and shook the red-haired man's tired body. How dare you speak to the divine vessel like that, Harold? Boom, boom. An explosive fist connected with his face, knocking him a few feet away from Adrian, who ignored him and smiled at the clearly annoyed baby. I'm glad to say it, but I'm going to have to cut this party short. When you die, could you tell your mummies to FK off for me? Wah. His mind clouded slightly, and he staggered a little, but shaking his head, Adrian snorted in delight. Flora, for her part, could only let out a heavy, long sigh, trying to keep herself from screaming in frustration. After all, she had said she had already resigned herself. Yes. You also brought out the bitch from both of them. Screaming and crying like newborn rats, just as horrible, the redhead continued with a chuckle as the baby's crying intensified. Then, Adrian took a step aside, dodging the crimson sickle that had left a deep gash in the ground. His gaze fell momentarily on the angry doctor, who stepped out of the shadows nearby. Oh, the stepfather comes to defend his daughter. How honorable. Damn you, Kenway. The doctor gritted his teeth in pure hatred, black liquid dripping from his rotting muscles and the scythe in his hand glowing a deep crimson with sparks from its blade. How dare you! How dare you! How dare you! Spittle and black liquid poured from his mouth, pure rage in his tone. The sparks on the scythe became crimson flashes. What do you want me to say? I hate all filth, especially these pieces of shit. Laughing, Adrian took a leap, propelled by Sky Wach, and spun around, tossing the white spear in his hand, and that includes you. Damned cockroach. The spear flew with power, hissing from the speed, and the doctor was forced to grab the still dazed Tyre and leap into the shadows to dodge the attack. Boom. He leapt out of the shadows and looked at the area where the spear had struck, leaving a huge bonfire of golden fire. The doctor released Tyre and looked around furiously. Where are you? Where are you, Kenway? The man roared as the scythe released more sparks. Show yourself, Herald. Tyre stared at the golden bonfire from his position on the ground in horror. To see one of his strong comrades die in such a brutal manner was a brutal blow to his weak psyche, and the baby's continued crying only made it worse. The skin on his cheek began to rot, and the pale skin took on a bluish hue. This isn't human. It's a monster. The zombie whispered, half awake. The mutations in his body continued to grow, and one of his irises had turned white. Unaware of his changes, Tyre turned to face the doctor, tears of blood falling from his eyes. The baby's cries had become white noise to him. My lord, what shall we do now? You can die for me. That's a good idea. Adrian roared, leaping from the flames of the campfire as he thrust a white spear at them with his left hand. Gritting his teeth, the doctor leapt backward to get away from where the spear would land. Tyre just stared at the spear. Both his eyes were white now, and an animal snarl came from his mouth. His skin was completely blue and rotting. At his feet, ice began to spread across the stones like a disease. The veins in his neck swelled, and his eyes bulged slightly from their sockets. Seeing that only one more blow was needed to close the coffin, Adrian decided that it was finally time to finish them. His voice was extremely condescending and mocking, completely focused on the baby. What's the matter, little monster? Are you frustrated because you can't kill me? Do you want to cry? Go ahead and cry. Cry to your mommies and ask them to save you. Maybe if you scream loud enough, they can hear you over all the dicks in their heads. Or maybe not. Being the great supreme whores they are, I doubt they give a damn what happens to you. The veins in the big little body swelled grotesquely, the reproductive organs began to gush blood, and the thing's huge fist struck the stone, shattering it with ease. Its cloudy purple eyes swelled and glowed bloody as its chest swallowed a huge amount of air. Wah! The scream pierced through the very spirituality that contained such a terrible cry, ripping and destroying the very depths of the beings present. Zombie Tyre's eyes quickly swelled like balloons and exploded in black blood, followed closely by his head and body. The doctor and Adrian fell to the ground, their bodies convulsing almost uncontrollably. The redhead felt his mind being ripped away and treated like a simple rag, he felt it trying to leave his body. His already difficult vision was tinged with red and part of it turned black. His mind was falling into the abyss and he was moments away from losing control. But just before that happened, all the noise was silenced. An enormous calm washed over him, and Adrian felt extremely relaxed. It was as if he could now sleep peacefully and rest in peace. Lowering his gaze to his torso, a hollow chuckle left his lips. Covering it and almost completely invisible, as if it were an illusion or a trick of the mind, was an almost completely transparent black tunic. Just in time, Hunter's Hallow. With an inner thank you and not wanting to miss the opportunity he had just created, Adrian reached for the grotesque baby with great effort. His helmet cracked back into his euphoric bloody grin and quickly reformed. Adrian shouted at the top of his lungs, "Steal!" Wah! Gah! The baby's heart-wrenching, soul-shattering scream was abruptly cut off, a supremely confused expression on his hideous face that would look cute if you were drunk and drugged enough. This expression only lasted a few seconds before it turned angry. Looking around, the baby's expression went from angry to slightly dazed. Its protectors were lying on the ground, all dead and almost none of them intact. They had all been torn apart by the man of golden flames, who was slowly rising to his feet. The baby's expression quickly turned to terror as the one remaining eye on the man's face glowed with enormous intensity. Enormous hatred and anger burned deep within him, fueled by an enormous bloodlust. Unprotected and with fear quickly consuming it, the baby crawled into the remains of the womb, using the remains as a sheet. In the next instant, the fleshy tree trunks that had been sunk into the ground began to move, quickly raising the platform with the baby on it and sending it flying upwards with ridiculous speed. Rumble, rumble, rumble. The earth cracked and began to shake, and gritting his teeth, Adrian forced his armor back up and took a huge leap. He was ready to go after the baby as it fled into the storm above. "You piece of shit. I won't let you." Bait him. His vision blurred, and a terrible, sharp pain struck deep inside him. As he fell to the ground with a thud, blood spurted from his eyes, and his armor vanished. Horrible black cracks appeared on his right hand and began to spread rapidly up it, reaching his shoulder. Bluff rrrr. A stream of blood poured from his mouth, accompanied by black and burgundy splatters. His vision blurred, and Adrian could almost feel himself passing out. His soul cried out in pain. Cough, 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 knowing that he had reached his limit and that going beyond it would kill him. Adrian stopped burning his insides and let the already very slow regeneration repair what was left of his body so that it and his soul could become one again. Gritting his teeth and ignoring the bile on the roof of his mouth, Adrian began to stand shakily. His movements were labored and somewhat awkward. Huff, huff, huff. The red-haired man struggled to his feet, breathing heavily. His body was completely covered in large wounds, dripping blood onto the rest of his clothes. The black gashes on his arm were still there, and although the rest of his wounds were healing slowly, they didn't seem to be healing at all. Huff, 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 huff. This, huff. That was incredibly stupid. Adrian scoffed at his own stupidity. His threads drew the characteristics of Joseph. He dropped towards him, but he didn't grab them, instead hovering them beside him. He had provoked experiment 839 to raise his scream, eliminating Tyre and leaving the rest of them extremely damaged, but he had managed to save himself because there was a chance that Hunter Hallow would act. Dying so many times had to take a lot out of his mind to think this was a good idea. He expected some kind of mental retaliation from a certain worm, but to his disappointment, there was only silence. With an inward sigh, Adrian's eyes glowed with determination. Fighting his body's pleas, he took a step. The armor began to envelop him again. Before he began to run after the baby, his spirituality flared and his tired eye twitched to the side. In a similar state to the already dead zombie Tyre. Half of the doctor's body was already lying there, a large black puddle growing beneath his body. Swallowing a mouthful of saliva mixed with blood, Adrian snorted ungracefully and reached out his hand to where the man lay. "Do you really think I'm going to fall for my own trick?" Adrian said, extremely tired but with some amusement in his voice. A great torrent of golden fire shot out, eager to devour the man's unconscious body. Like a bull, the torrent continued on its way, devouring everything in its path. Its flames quickly consumed the place where the doctor's body once lay. The doctor's torso-less legs emerged from the shadows a few dozen meters from where he had originally stood. Adrian's cold scarlet eyes followed it. "Who do you think you are?" Cell. Unable to avoid the comparison to the perfect life form, Adrian swallowed his frustration. Raising an eyebrow at the torso-less legs, he asked, "Really? That's the best you could come up with? This is a most curious development." His eyes widened in surprise. He hadn't expected the legs to talk. Gritting his teeth, Adrian shook off his surprise and held out his hands. A bow of fire and an arrow formed. "Are you talking out of your ass? I always knew shit came out of your mouth, but this is another level." The conspirator snarled and released the arrow. The arrow hit the legs squarely and exploded in a shower of golden fire. Narrowing his eyes, Adrian looked at the remains of the legs. "I admit it, Mr. Kenway. I shouldn't have underestimated you as I did. That was a big mistake on my part." Without thinking, the flames that covered Adrian spread, creating a huge sacred fire. He turned with cold eyes. Adrian watched as, a few meters away, a being of shadows and some sort of reddish-black liquid melted into black dust. Its form grew smaller and smaller as it was revealed before him. Crimson eyes in what looked like a face watched him coldly. I put a lot of energy into this avatar. It's really disappointing that this is the best it could do. Knowing what this meant, Adrian let out a long, guttural growl. You were never here. It was already becoming extremely strange to him how the new path worked. In some places, his abilities exceeded those of a normal Sequence 5, but he also noticed that in other places, he acted normal or failed badly. Something was wrong. The golden bonfire and the crimson light danced a little. Debris and rocks from the roof collapsed and were about to fall. I don't have time for this. Adrian grunted and took a deep, powerful step. Skywalk propelled him upwards towards the storm on the horizon. It took him a few seconds to realize that the shadow could no longer hurt him, it had only managed to take precious seconds away from him. Gritting his teeth, Adrian watched as the platform receded and the roof of the cave began to fall. He would not make it in time before he was buried. Thinking quickly, a hook formed in his hand. His threads quickly attached themselves to it. He threw it hard towards the throne that was quickly emerging and hooked onto one of the many fleshy lumps coming out of it. Immediately, his body was violently pulled upwards. Adrian strengthened his armor as his body was slammed into the tree. Using his threads, he tied himself to other protrusions to avoid further blows, while creating a web of threads in front of him to block the rocks falling towards him. The wind hit him hard in the face and rattled his armor. As he watched the red-haired man fly away, the doctor let out a graceful chuckle and bowed deeply. If you survive this, I'm sure we'll meet again, Mr. Kenway. His body finally crumbled to dust. His dark, elegant laugh drifted on the wind and reached the ears of Adrian, who gritted his teeth and clung with all his might to the trunk as it rose into the storm.